Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So, before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. I never thought that an ordinary day could change my life forever. My day began like all the others. I woke up to the sound of rain pounding hard on the window panes. That heavy rain that always heralds a storm. The gray sky made me feel somewhat melancholy, as if the day was as gray as my mood at that moment. Coffee, hot and comforting, filled the kitchen with its aroma halfway between routine and necessary. And then there was the feeling of being trapped in a cycle I couldn't escape, but even that didn't alarm me. I dressed quickly, put on my jacket, and left for work. Nothing indicated that this day would turn into hell. I work in a small grocery store, a modest place, but well known in the neighborhood. Every day, without exception, I saw the same faces, the same customers, the same tired faces of whom I never wondered too much, but whom I greeted with kindness. I was a sort of shadow among them, neither too important nor too irrelevant, just another cog in the machinery of that routine that seemed eternal. Everything went along with an enviable calm. There was no room for stress or anxiety. Money was barely coming in, but just enough to live on and keep the place afloat. There was always something peaceful on rainy days, as if the storm cleaned the city and everything became calmer, more manageable. That day, the weather was the same as always. The rain was pounding the ground hard, and the drops sliding down the glass gave a sense of confinement. Inside the tent, the air was somewhat stale, like the routine atmosphere that had stagnated over the months. The tent was not large, but just enough to make me feel comfortable. In the background, the sound of soft music on the radio and the low murmur of the conversations of the few customers soothed me. The same monotony as every day. I clearly remember the face of the customer I was serving at the time. An older man, with gray hair, thick glasses, and a kind but tired expression. He was one of those who came in every day, always looking for an excuse to chat about anything. In his eyes there was a mixture of wisdom and years lost in the wrinkles that marked his face. That day, he talked about the weather, as he did every day. I was nodding my head, hoping that nothing would interrupt such a trivial conversation. I didn't understand why, but something told me that everything would change. Suddenly, the door of the store burst open. The little bell rang with a different tone than usual, a more strident, more urgent one. At that moment, the air became thicker. The sound of the rain outside faded, and the store fell into an eerie silence, as if everything had been suspended in time. Two men entered. Immediately my stomach tensed. The shadows under their hoods obscured their faces, but something in the way they moved alerted me that they were not simple shoppers. The first man was tall, stocky, and wore a black leather jacket that shimmered slightly despite the rain. The second man, of average height, was thinner, but his presence was no less intimidating. Both walked with the same assurance, the same firm step that indicated they knew exactly what they were doing. I didn't dare look them in the face. I dared not do anything. The tent, once my refuge, now became a prison. The air became unbreathable. The taller man waved his hand, and the metallic sound of a gun being drawn made me jump. My body froze. I didn't know if I should run or stand still. Fear began to rise in my throat like a ball of fire. The customer in front of me, the man who used to smile at me every day, immediately stepped back. His eyes, so kind and calm, were filled with terror. The first man, the taller one, stared at me and raised his gun towards me. The order was clear, dry. There were no extra words, no bombastic threats, just a direct request. The money. All the money, he expressed to me, without any emotion, as if he were requesting something as basic as a pack of cigarettes. Time seemed to stand still. My mind began to wonder if this was a nightmare, if at some point I would wake up. But no, the cold reality was before me. Beads of sweat began to run down my face. My hands clutched at the counter as if they might offer me some protection, but I knew that was not the case. The tent, which had once been a refuge, was now a strange, alien place. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the whispers of the men and the pattering of the rain that kept lashing the glass of the windows. The client remained motionless, not daring to speak, and so did I. I couldn't think, I couldn't move. I couldn't think, I couldn't move. I could only listen to the sound of the plastic bag that the thin man began to fill with money. The crunch of the bills going into the bag was like a stab in my conscience. I couldn't stop thinking about how everything I had known up to that moment was crumbling before my eyes. The hours passed strangely. Every minute seemed to last longer than usual, and I, trapped in that nightmare, could do nothing but follow the instructions of those two men. I felt like I was watching my life from the outside, as if they were watching me from a dark corner, unable to intervene. The men didn't seem to be in a hurry. The calmness with which they moved was even more frightening to me. There was no shouting, no hurry. Everything was under control. At some point, fear began to turn to despair. The first man began to search the place, opening drawers and shelves with disturbing thoroughness. The second, calmer one kept me under surveillance, pointing his gun at me incessantly. My thoughts kept coming back to the same place. Would I get out of there alive? Would I be left standing after this robbery? The feeling of helplessness was consuming me. I felt my breath hitching, but I dared not make a sound. Every move was a risk, and in my head, any mistake could mean the end. I felt trapped in a tunnel with no way out, where the only sound was the pounding of the wind and the rain. Time grew heavier with each passing second, when finally, after what seemed like an eternity, one of them made a hand signal. I understood that it was all over. Without another word, they instructed me to bend down, not to look directly at them. The first man made me walk to the back of the store. I didn't dare look back. The door slammed shut behind me. The sound was like a sentence. I stood outside in the rain, not knowing what to do or where to go. I felt the wetness on my clothes, but it wasn't the rain that soaked me. It was the fear that would never go away. As I walked down the sidewalk, my body trembled involuntarily, and the drops of water falling on me felt as if they were washing away a part of my soul. The tent, my tent, was no longer a safe place. There was something irretrievable that had broken inside me. It wasn't just the robbery. It was the fact that my life, as I knew it, had ceased to exist. The days following the robbery seemed to pass in a kind of haze. The store was still open. The same old customers came in as if nothing had changed, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The routine no longer made sense to me. Everything looked the same on the outside, but inside I felt fractured, a shadow of who I was before that afternoon. Somehow, I had been scarred by the violence I had witnessed, even though it had never touched me directly. Still, every time I heard a sound out of place, panic gripped my body. A faint sound, like a footstep on gravel, would make me jump. The sound of the door opening now seemed like a death sentence. Something I had never feared before had now settled deep inside me. The tent, which at one time seemed to me a refuge, was now just a prison, an invisible prison, built by my own fear. I spent my days with my eyes always alert, my back stiff, my pulse racing, as if I expected the men to return at any moment. I couldn't help it. I had learned that what seemed safe was only an illusion. The customers arrived as usual, their faces impassive, but I no longer saw the same. Each one of them could be a threat. The man with the cart full of fruit could be the same one who pressed me against the wall that afternoon. The older woman, with her white hair, could be the robber's accomplice. I didn't trust anyone, or what I saw. Everything seemed suspicious to me. The rain, constant and heavy, only increased that feeling of suffocation, of claustrophobia, as if the whole world was closing in on me, squeezing tighter and tighter. At first, I tried to carry on as normal, as if nothing had happened, but it was impossible. The first night after the assault, I woke up several times, sweating, my heart racing, thinking someone was inside my apartment. I would get up quickly, check the locks, the windows, The first time I did it, I thought I was overreacting. But the next day, I realized it wasn't just a passing scare. The nights got longer. I could no longer sleep peacefully. Noises from outside were amplified in my head, becoming echoes of my fears. Every time I went outside, I felt that someone was watching me, following me from the shadows. The feeling of being chased became a constant. And the worst thing, the most terrifying thing, was that I didn't know if those men were still somewhere nearby, waiting for the right moment to hunt me down. Fear began to invade every corner of my life. It affected me not only at work, but also at home. I could no longer walk the streets as I used to. The same sidewalks I used to walk on with ease now felt like paths into a trap. The streetlights flickered, the shadows lengthened, and, in my mind, every corner could hide those two men. The feeling of vulnerability was unbearable. My steps became faster, more frantic. Every movement of the people around me made me think that someone was watching me, that someone might be waiting for the perfect moment to catch me. Sometimes, I wondered if all this was not just a product of my paranoia. But the sleepless nights told me otherwise. The loneliness of my apartment was more unbearable than ever. There were days when I felt that everything had changed irreversibly. Not only the place where I worked, but myself. I was no longer the same man who had walked into that store one afternoon. My life had been altered, and I didn't know how to return it to its normal course. One afternoon, as I was closing up store, I stopped in front of the bathroom mirror in the store, looking at my reflection. The light in the hallway was dim, almost dark, but still, I could see the wear and tear on my face. The shadows under my eyes, the empty glow in my gaze. I had lost something of myself, something irretrievable. I didn't understand it at first, but as the days passed, I realized that confidence was gone. I no longer felt in control of my life. I no longer felt safe in my own space. Worst of all, I realized that fear knew no bounds. It was no longer just the fear of what could happen, but of what had already happened, to what had been torn away from me without warning. As the days went by, I began to modify my routine. Little things changed, things that I didn't consider important before. I no longer took the same route to the store, nor the same route home. Every time I went out, I looked over my shoulder, watched the buildings, the parked cars, the shadows on the streets. There was something unsettling about the night hours. I felt haunted by my own fear, by the paranoia that was growing more and more in my head. At first, I thought it was normal to feel this way after a robbery, but then I realized that it wasn't just the fear of being attacked again, but the fear that everything I thought was safe was no longer safe. That night, in front of the mirror, I didn't just see a terrified man. I saw someone who had stopped trusting his own existence, who was no longer able to walk the streets without feeling vulnerable. It was then that I began to take precautions. I checked the window locks, the doors, even the doorknob of the main door, as if a small imperfection in the security could be the crack through which everything would fall apart. But it wasn't enough. As soon as I turned off the lights, fear came over me again. The noises of the city, the sirens, the distant screams, everything seemed threatening. The rain kept falling, as if the storm would never cease to wash away my peace. In the middle of the night, I would wake up sweaty, with the feeling that something or someone was there, waiting in the dark. My fingers would press against the sheets, my eyes would roam the room, searching for something that didn't exist, but in my mind was real. The silence that was so familiar to me before now weighed me down like a slab. The sound of the wind, like a distant whisper, was the only company I had. Weeks went by in this way, and the worst part of it all was that I could not find a way out. Fear was not something tangible. I couldn't confront it head-on. I couldn't fight against something that only existed in my head, and the scariest thing was that I knew I wasn't alone. I was not alone in that feeling. The world, my world, had changed. Reality was no longer the same. The fear, the doubt, the distrust, all of it had transformed me. I was not only haunted by the memories of the assault, I was haunted by the echo of what that day had done to my mind, to my life. The nights seemed endless, and the day that followed was just an extension of that darkness that would not leave me alone. The rain never stopped, and I, trapped in my own fear, understood a bitter lesson. It was no longer I who decided in my life. Fear, that fear that had been born of two men, now ruled everything. And worst of all, there was no way to escape. Fear has an insidious way of transforming us. It changes us inside without us even noticing, until we are no longer able to recognize our own existence. The men who robbed the store may have been nothing more than simple thieves, but what they really stole from me was something far more valuable: my trust in the world, in others, and in myself. We live surrounded by a false security, thinking that our lives are unshakable, but it only takes a second, a single incident, to realize how vulnerable we are. Fear is not just a passing feeling. It is a shadow that stays with us, reminding us that we are not always in control of what happens. And worst of all, sometimes the worst enemy is not what is outside, but what is inside us. There was something unsettling about the nights, something that lurked around every corner, that got under your skin and stayed there, like a shadow that followed you. It happened to me every night, but I didn't think about it while I was working. I was a food delivery man, and in those dark hours of the night, the city seemed to be mine, empty and desolate, but also full of secrets, of flashing lights in the windows of buildings and lonely streets that opened up before me like a labyrinth with no way out. That night it was raining hard. The rain was falling like knives on the asphalt, creating puddles in every corner. The city seemed to be sleeping, but I was awake, riding the streets under the flickering headlights of my motorcycle, following the trail of the traffic lights. Everything seemed the same, everything except for a call I received at the end of my shift. It was a strange call. I couldn't tell right away, but there was something in the tone of the customer's voice that made me raise an eyebrow. The order was for Chinese food, which wasn't unusual, but the address was unlike any I'd ever delivered before. An out-of-the-way neighborhood, in an alley I didn't recognize, in an almost forgotten part of town. It was not a place you went to for no reason, much less at that hour. The customer's voice was masculine, but there was also something strange about it. As if he was speaking from a very distant place, his voice almost muffled by the sound of the rain. He gave me precise instructions, too precise, and a payment that seemed exaggeratedly high for a simple food order. I thought maybe it was a generous tip or a joke, but the truth is I didn't want to question it. I needed the money. "Yes, sir, I'll be there in a few minutes," I replied, still with an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I started the bike, my breath catching in my helmet, and headed in that unfamiliar direction. Each kilometer took me a little further away from the comfort of my usual route, from the neighborhoods I knew well. The further I went, the more I realized that the area seemed to be deserted, and there was nothing but darkness around every corner. The rain did not stop falling. The sound of the drops on my helmet clouded my senses, but forced me to stay alert. My mind began to make assumptions. What kind of person would make such a strange request at this hour? Why so late and in such a secluded place? Finally, I arrived at my destination. It was a large, old house, far from the rest, as if it had been forgotten by time. It had a desolate air, the windows dark, with no lights on. Nothing moved. Nothing sounded. Only the constant pattering of the rain on the roof, and the dull sound of the drops falling to the ground. I stopped the bike in front of the entrance. I looked at the house one more time. Something about it didn't fit, but I didn't know what. There was an air of abandonment, and the mist in the air made everything seem even more unreal. I got off the bike with the order in my hands, and as I approached the door, I noticed that the doorbell was not ringing. That wasn't unusual. Electricity often failed in such remote places. What was odd was that, as I knocked on the door, I heard no movement inside. I tried again, this time harder, until I heard light, almost inaudible footsteps approaching from inside. Then, the door slowly opened, letting out a cold draft that made me shiver. A man appeared in the doorway. He was tall, of medium build, and his face was somber, dark, as if he had been waiting there for hours. His gaze was fixed, distant, and he did not smile. He said nothing. He simply waved his hand, beckoning me to enter. Despite the discomfort I felt, I couldn't refuse the payment, and I thought that maybe it was one of those strange but harmless situations. So I went inside, delivered the food, and picked up the money. As he took the order, his gaze never left me, as if studying me with an almost unbearable fixation. Everything about his attitude was silent, strange. It didn't feel right, but I didn't know exactly what was wrong. Before I left, I felt that someone else was in the house. A rustling, or a slight creaking from the upper floor which made me look up, but there was nothing, not another sound, just the feeling of being watched. Something didn't fit, but I couldn't turn back now. I couldn't just walk away. I turned around and walked out. As I walked toward the door, the man stood there, motionless. He didn't look at me, just stood in the same place, as if I didn't care about his presence. He closed the door with a soft but firm knock, and at that moment, something inside me stirred. The money he had given me was excessive, but, strangest of all, it looked freshly counted. It was too perfect, too clean, as if it wasn't money from that city, as if it didn't belong there. I couldn't understand it at the time, but I got on the bike and left. Something told me I had to leave as quickly as possible. The air was no longer cool and comforting, but thick and cold, as if the wind was trapped in some dark corner of the city. I started the bike, but as I turned the first corner, I realized something wasn't right. At first, I ignored it. I thought it was paranoia, the stress of working at night. But as I passed a deserted street, I began to feel it. Something was following me. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something moving behind me. But I couldn't identify it. I thought it was the reflection of car lights, but every time I turned a corner, that figure seemed to be one step behind me. I couldn't see details, but something told me I wasn't alone. The sound of the rain had become deafening. The drops were hitting the asphalt like hammers, but my attention was completely focused on the figure I felt behind me. I accelerated, but the figure also accelerated, keeping the exact distance. My hands were sweating and my heart was pounding, while the streets stretched out in front of me as if they would never end. The buildings became distorted shadows, and the feeling of being watched grew. Every turn, every corner I took, I felt that this thing, this presence, was also turning with me. Fear began to take hold of me with such intensity that it clouded my mind. What did it want? Why was it following me? What was in that man? In that house? Suddenly, something stopped me in my tracks. A noise, a rustling coming from a nearby alley. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was there. It was too strong a sensation to ignore. I stopped the bike, looked around, and turned off the engine. The rain was still coming down hard. I felt my breathing quicken. I looked ahead, and then I saw him. A figure, right at the edge of my vision. This time, it wasn't just a shadow. This time, it was there, steps away from me. Fear enveloped me, and before I could react, I felt something cold grip my back. The sound of the rain covered everything, and visibility was reduced to just a few meters in front of me. My breathing became heavier, and every nerve in my body seemed to be tensed to the limit. I could see nothing beyond the figure that had materialized in the shadow of the corner. My mind was filled with chaotic thoughts. Was I dreaming? Was it just a hallucination out of fear? No. That figure was too close, and my body was telling me clearly I was in danger. The bike was off, the engine no longer made any noise, and for an instant, all I could hear was the constant hammering of the rain on the pavement. But that figure, that shadow gliding with a movement that seemed almost fluid, did not allow me to rest. My skin bristled. Beads of sweat began to mix with the rain, and my mind, paralyzed by uncertainty, tried to analyze what to do. I stood still, breathing hard, unable to move. The fear was so thick, so palpable, that I felt as if the atmosphere was closing in on me. The figure didn't move for a while, and that only increased the sense of danger. I knew I couldn't just stand there waiting. There was something more to all this, something deeper and darker than just a stranger following a food delivery man, but I didn't know what it was exactly. Then a noise broke the silence, a small rustle of dry leaves, as if someone was approaching from the alley. It was such a faint sound that I couldn't even determine where it was coming from. I turned my head quickly both ways, but saw nothing, just rain and darkness. Yet that figure, that presence, was still real, like a shadow moving on the periphery of my vision. A whisper of icy wind blew through me, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to do something before it was too late. Something inside me told me I should run, but my bike was too far away, and the narrow alley gave me no room to maneuver. I decided to take the risk. I slowly got up from the bike, my legs shaking, almost without control. Every step I took seemed to echo in the air, amplified by the storm. My mind was conflicted. Run away or face whatever was watching me. I opted for the former, because deep down I knew I wasn't prepared to face something like that. I began to walk, quickening my pace without losing sight of the shadow. I could not see it clearly, but I could feel it close. The feeling that someone was watching me intensified, as if it was about to fall on me. Every time I turned, I was certain that the shadow was also turning. Every sound of footsteps, every crunch of wet earth beneath my feet, it was as if a pair of invisible eyes were stalking me. Paranoia had completely taken hold of me. When I reached the corner of the alley, the figure disappeared. But I did not relax. I couldn't. I shouldn't. Instead of feeling relieved, the shadow's disappearance filled me with more uncertainty. I was so close to getting out of there, so close to putting distance between me and my pursuit, that the thought that this could be just the beginning raced through me. I decided to speed up, not only my steps, but also my thoughts. What if that figure was not alone? What if there was something much bigger behind all this? The fears I had previously been able to rid myself of clung tightly to my mind. I turned around, but the alley was empty. There was no sign of the figure, not even a shadow to indicate his presence to me. Taking one last look back, I decided to keep running. I looked around once more, but the feeling of being watched did not disappear. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, as if the city had suddenly shrunk. I quickened my pace until I reached the next intersection. It was there that I saw it, a car parked on the corner. The vehicle was dark, with no lights on, and despite the rain, the driver's window was down, as if waiting for someone. My heart skipped a beat. It could not be a coincidence. That figure that had followed me here was surely waiting in that car. At that precise moment, I knew I was trapped. I stopped dead in my tracks. The car did not move. The rain continued to fall heavily, but now I felt that the world around me had become more oppressive, more dense. It was as if the rain had cut me off from the rest of the city, and the sound of the drops hitting the roofs of the buildings was the only thing I could hear. But something didn't fit. Why hadn't he moved yet? Why hadn't he approached me? It was as if he was waiting for me to make the wrong decision, as if everything was carefully calculated. That feeling came over me, but I couldn't be sure of anything. I could not afford to trust my thoughts. I decided to walk to the car. I didn't feel comfortable. I wasn't sure what would happen if I did, but I couldn't stand there in the rain with the feeling of being watched every second. I took one step, then another. My feet barely touched the ground. Restlessness was growing inside me, and as I got closer to the car, I realized how easy it was to fall into the trap. That feeling, that need to get to a safe place was completely controlling me. My hand reached to the edge of the car door, and when I touched it, the vehicle began to move, but not forward. The car began to spin in place, and somehow, I felt cornered in that space. I could see a figure inside the car, a fuzzy shadow that seemed to be watching me, but it was not the same man from the house. No, this was a different figure. With a speed I didn't understand, the car began to drive away, and then I understood. He had been leading me to him. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. At that moment, something inside me shut down. I knew I couldn't leave, that it wasn't going to be so easy to escape. In life, there are moments that establish a starting point and a turning point. They are those moments when you make decisions without thinking about the consequences, without measuring the risk. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how much you think you know about the city or the people who inhabit it, there is always something else out there, something in the shadows waiting patiently for the right moment to strike. The world may seem controlled, but the game pieces are constantly moving, and it's easy to fall into the trap without even noticing. The real question is not whether we will escape, but how many times we will be stalked before we understand that paranoia is a form of survival. And when we finally fall, that's when we realize how fragile the boundary between normality and chaos is. My shift started like any other. The rain was pounding on the windshield with an almost hypnotic force, but it was something I was used to. In my job as a cab driver, rainy nights were common. Only that night, something was different. I didn't know it at first, but I knew it when that man got into the cab. He was an ordinary guy, apparently. Tall, somewhat scruffy-looking, with a few days-old beard. He had sunken eyes, as if he hadn't slept well in days. At first, I thought he was just another bored passenger who just wanted to get to his destination as fast as possible. But from the first moment he boarded, something unsettled me. Something that I could not clearly define, but that became more palpable with each passing minute. I climbed into the driver's seat and adjusted the rearview mirror. The man didn't say a word, just handed me an address written on a crumpled piece of paper, without even looking at me. It was a remote address, in an industrial part of town, where the lights from the street lights were blurred by the curtain of rain that was falling heavily. It was not a place ordinary people went to at this hour. I started the engine and took the usual route. The sound of the engine and the rain against the roof of the vehicle filled the uncomfortable silence between us. For a couple of minutes, there was not a sound other than the noise of the windshield wiper moving back and forth. But I began to notice something strange. The man began to fidget nervously in his seat, looking out the window, and at every red light, his gaze became more anxious, more unnerving. I felt a growing pressure in my chest, as if something in his behavior was triggering a primal instinct, one that told me something wasn't right. It wasn't normal for someone to be so tense for no apparent reason, without any interaction. I began to observe him more closely, unnoticed by him. His clothes were somewhat dirty, his hands were large and strong, but his fingernails were cut in half, as if he had had to hurry to do it. His beard was poorly manicured, and his jaw constantly strained. But what bothered me most was the fact that his eyes never left the window, as if he was looking for something, or someone. The traffic light changed to green, and the cab began to move through the wet streets. The rain seemed to be getting heavier, as if the storm was gathering strength. But the man was still looking out the window, with a fixed, absent expression, as if he wasn't there with me. Then, in one of those quick glances I took in the rearview mirror, I saw something that chilled my blood. His hand moved slowly toward his coat pocket. I couldn't see what he pulled out, but he did it with a calmness that was anything but natural. I felt the air in the car grow heavier, as if something had crept in and couldn't get out. I tried not to think about it, but I couldn't help it. My instinct was telling me I needed to be alert. My mind began to wander to the situation. The guy hadn't uttered a single word since he got on. He had barely made a sound, but his nerves were on full display. Why was a passenger behaving like this? A regular passenger would simply stare out the window, not getting agitated by every little movement I made behind the wheel. A regular passenger wouldn't act like he was waiting for something bad to happen, as if he was the only one who knew something I didn't know. Then I decided to change the route, out of pure intuition. If something wasn't right, I had to take precautions. I remembered a side street I could take, one that would take me along emptier roads, away from the main avenues where traffic was heavier. I didn't know if the man would notice the change, but if he was following me, it would be better to avoid danger. As I rounded the corner onto the more desolate street, I saw through the rearview mirror that the man didn't move an inch. His posture remained rigid, his gaze still fixed on the window, but something inside me began to grow alarmed. There was something strange about his attitude. He knew what was happening, he felt it, and the uneasiness in the air was becoming more and more unbearable. When I reached the next intersection, I decided to turn left, into a darker area. I could no longer disguise that something was wrong, and my instinct told me to be cautious. Somehow, I couldn't stop thinking about the feeling of being watched. The man was still, his eyes unmoving. It was no longer just nervousness. Now there was something else, a palpable presence, as if he was waiting for me to make a mistake. It was then that I heard something that cut the silence. The man moved, almost imperceptibly, as if he had been waiting for the right moment. I watched as his hand moved slowly toward his coat pocket. A metallic sound came from inside, a sound of something falling to the floor. Fear gripped me. I didn't know what was happening, but my body knew. The tension was unbearable. It was at that moment that the lights of another vehicle briefly illuminated the interior of the cab. A split second was enough to see what he was doing. The man was no longer holding anything in his hand. His hand had returned to his pocket, but I saw the glint of metal, shiny, a knife. My whole body instantly tensed up. What the hell was going on? My mind started racing. Had this man gotten into the cab with the intention of doing something to someone? To me? Everything was falling apart around me. I could no longer trust the calmness with which he continued to observe the outside. That calm was just a facade. He was a killer, and I was caught in his trap. There was no way of knowing if his intentions were murderous, but I could already feel it in my gut. The rain was coming down harder, and the streetlights were beginning to become diffuse. The darkness seemed to eat up the space around the cab, and the tension was such that it felt as if the whole world had stopped. But there was no turning back. The only option was to keep driving and expect the worst. The rain did not stop. It pounded harder against the roof of the cab, as if the sky was trying to overflow and drag us down with it. Each drop that crashed against the windshield increased the pressure in my chest, as if time itself had stopped and I was trapped in an endless cycle of terror. The darkness of the night, mixed with the shadows cast by distant streetlights, enveloped everything. I was alone in the car, with a strange man beside me, a man who no longer seemed so unfamiliar. I watched him through the rear-view mirror, observing my reflection with the same eerie calm I had shown from the beginning. I knew something wasn't right. The way he stood still, not moving a muscle, told me he was waiting for something. Maybe, just maybe, he was waiting for the perfect moment to act. The knife, now reflected in the dim light of the cab, gleamed with silent menace. The image of its gleaming edge took my breath away. At that moment, my thoughts clouded. My mind, which had already been alert from the discomfort I felt, was now completely consumed by the thought of what might happen next. With each passing second, the man seemed closer to doing what he had climbed into the cab to do, a victim. Without thinking too hard, I gripped the steering wheel tightly. The skin on my hands tightened, as if fear had injected energy into my body. I couldn't let it control me. I couldn't let myself panic. But I also knew I was about to enter dangerous territory. My survival instinct began to take over. I had to think fast. I looked through the rearview mirror, but I no longer saw just a man who was simply sitting in the back seat. Now I saw something else. A fixed, calculating gaze that seemed to pierce me as if it could read me through the mist of the rain. The tension grew and the atmosphere became more oppressive with each passing second. The car was moving through the wet streets, but my mind was focused on only one thing: the way the man had placed his hand on his coat. I knew what that meant. I realized I needed to do something. Letting myself get carried away with anxiety and hoping the man would just go away was not an option. I had to act. I didn't have much time before the situation became even more dangerous. But if I could find an opportunity, however slim, I could escape. I decided that the only way to deal with the situation was to change the course of events. With a subtle movement, I turned the steering wheel, heading toward a side street that I knew was empty, away from the city lights. I had to change the scenery, create an environment that would give me some advantage. Maybe, if I could get to a better lit area, I could call for help or find an opportunity to escape. But it was not enough. The feeling of being watched increased with every turn I made, and the instant I reached the empty street, I knew the chance to escape was gone. When I looked again in the rearview mirror, I saw his eyes, intense, fixed, and I knew immediately. I was too late. There was no turning back. The man was not nervous, as I thought at first. There was no fear in his gaze. There was a calculating gleam. I wasn't his passenger. I wasn't someone he simply wanted to scare. I was his target, his prey. Everything in his demeanor told me he had already made up his mind. I was next. The car came to a screeching halt. My body reacted before my mind, and my heart pounded so hard that I felt as if the very sound of the pulse was pounding in my ears. In one swift movement, the man pulled out the knife, and for a second, everything froze. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to buy time, looking for an opportunity, a loophole, a solution, something that would get me out of that situation. But the passenger door opened with a low creak, a sound that froze me completely. I didn't see it coming. I couldn't react fast enough. With a violent movement, the man got out of the back seat and stood by the door, his knife glinting in the light of the street lamps. He said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. Every step he took toward me seemed slow and deliberate, as if everything was under his control. As he got closer, the rain and wind seemed to swirl around him, creating a claustrophobic feeling, as if the space in the car was shrinking and the air was getting thicker. At that moment, my mind went from denial to pure panic. But it was also when something else inside me awoke. My desire to survive. Fear, as paralyzing as it was giving way to adrenaline, to the need for action. So I made a decision. I couldn't just stand there doing nothing. I knew that if I didn't take control, he would. In one swift movement, I grabbed the car keys and stuck them in the ignition, starting the engine. The noise of the engine ignited a spark in my brain, and without further thought, I pushed the accelerator all the way down. The car shot forward, causing the man to stumble momentarily. It was enough. The cab skidded, turning a corner. I felt the car skid on the water accumulated on the pavement, but I managed to stabilize it. The feeling of being back in control gave me a brief sense of relief, but I knew I couldn't let go of the tension. I looked in the rearview mirror. The man had fallen to the ground, but quickly got up. I watched as he ran after the car, but this time I had the advantage. The streetlights shone in the distance. My mind was focused on one thing: escape. And I succeeded, by a hair's breadth. I didn't stop until I reached an open gas station. There I parked and got out of the car in a hurry, without looking back. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, and the fear remained, but in a different form. I was alive, yes, but something inside me had snapped. In the end, everything I had experienced that night left me with a bitter but profound lesson. Sometimes the worst threats do not come from where we least expect them. The face of that strange man, who at the time had been a mere passenger, was still etched in my mind. Deep down, I knew that the fear would never completely go away. Life after that encounter would not be the same. I could no longer look at each passenger without wondering what was really behind their eyes. And that, in a way, is what changes you. Not the fear itself, but what that fear makes you be afterwards. That afternoon seemed like any other. College was over, and the routine of taking the bus home had become a habit. The traffic was a mess, the streets jammed by the pouring rain. All I wanted was to get to my apartment soon, where I could take off my heavy backpack and enjoy some peace before nightfall. The bus was almost empty when I boarded, and I took my usual place near the window. The rain was pounding furiously against the windows, creating a claustrophobic feeling inside the vehicle, as if the outside world was becoming more and more distant. I could hear the sound of the roaring engine and the constant whirring of the windshield wipers, unable to stop the storm that was raining down on the city. It was not the first time I had traveled on that line at that time, so I already knew the route by heart. However, that afternoon something in the atmosphere made me uneasy. The people around me didn't seem any different, but there was something in the air, an inexplicable tension that I couldn't clearly identify. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was the clouds covering the sky, but the fact was that I didn't feel as calm as usual. Shortly after boarding, the bus made a stop in one of the most dangerous areas of the city. It was not a good place to stop, but the driver, as always, kept to his route. It was there that the unexpected happened. 3 men boarded the bus at that moment. They were one of those guys you would rather never see in life. Dirty, disheveled, with torn clothes, and a look that conveyed immediate danger. As soon as they entered, the atmosphere became denser, heavier. It was as if all the air had become thicker and harder to breathe. The first of them walked to the middle of the corridor, while the other 2 distributed themselves strategically, blocking the exits with their imposing bodies. I didn't need them to say a single word to know what was going on. There was something in their posture, in the way they moved, that was enough to make me understand that we were about to live an experience that none of us expected. They said nothing at first, but what happened next was almost immediate. Suddenly, one of the men began to speak in a raspy voice, demanding that we hand over all our belongings. This was not a simple robbery. It was something else, something that emanated from them, something wild, almost instinctive, as if they were enjoying the control they had over us. I saw some people trying to look around, looking for a way out, but they knew there was none. We were trapped. For a moment I thought about resisting, about running, about doing something, but there was no real option. They knew what they were doing, and their empty eyes made it clear. My heart began to pound. Fear began to take over my body, and the worst part was that I knew we were all in danger. In the blink of an eye, men began to demand more, not just money, but phones, watches, anything we could have. It didn't matter if it was a little or a lot, they didn't care. They just wanted to make sure we were completely stripped of anything we could use to defend ourselves. I was beaten, pushed into the nearby seats, but I kept silent. What else could I do? My hands were shaking as I handed over my phone and the small amount of money I had in my pocket. My only luck was that I managed to stay calm enough not to panic. For a brief moment I felt lucky, as if I was the only one who had managed to survive the ordeal, but I couldn't get my mind off what was going on around me. The other passengers were not so lucky. Some tried to resist, but were quickly silenced with a violence that did not stop until we were all at the same level of desperation. I saw an older man fall to the ground, struck by one of the robbers with a clenched fist. I could do nothing but watch, not knowing how to react. The bus continued its march, while the sound of the engine and the rain continued to cover everything. But now it was an empty sound, as if it was dragging us into an abyss from which there was no way out. But the creepiest thing was what happened at the end. As the men finally began to disembark from the bus, one of them stopped in front of me, as if he was sizing something up. He stared at me, his eyes dark and empty, and for a few seconds, I felt as if he was absorbing me, as if he was scanning me to see how far he could push me to the limit. He didn't say anything. He just walked away. The others followed him and the bus continued on its course. What happened next was even more disturbing. The silence that remained was heavier than the sound of the storm, and although we had already lost our belongings, what really marked us was not the violence itself, but the sense of vulnerability that hung in the air. I spent the rest of the ride in a state of shock. I could think of nothing but what I had just experienced. I had survived, yes, but something inside me had changed forever. I couldn't stop thinking about the other passengers, about those who were not as lucky as I was. The older man, the woman crying silently, the young man who had been beaten for refusing to hand over his cell phone. They were all victims of a system of violence that knows no mercy. The bus continued its journey, and with every kilometer we went, the tension in my chest became more unbearable. The rain was still pounding on the windows, but it no longer sounded like before. Now, the sound of the water sliding down the windows seemed like a distant echo that separated me from reality. My thoughts whirled around in my head, faster than the speed of the vehicle. But nothing seemed to make sense. How had it come to this? It had all been so fast. One moment I was sitting quietly, watching the city go by through the window, and the next, we were trapped, vulnerable, at the mercy of those three men. Fear, in its purest form, was not just the physical threat, but the feeling that everything I thought I knew was gone. That was the harsh truth. I could lose my life at any time, anywhere, and I had no control over it. That bus ride was no longer just another routine. It was an evocation of the vulnerability of human life. Who were we, the passengers, really? Hurried, tired people, traveling as if the outside world were just an extension of our lives. But that day, appearances were broken. In that brief instant, we all became prey, and the hunters needed no more than a glance to see our vulnerability. The storm had worsened, and as I looked at myself in the reflection of the fogged glass of the bus, I saw myself as someone different, even if I couldn't fully explain it. My mind was clouded by fear, but also by a feeling of helplessness. I saw the other passengers, their faces frozen, as if time itself had been suspended by fear. The older man who had fallen to the ground, now sitting with his head lowered, looked much more fragile than when he boarded the bus. The young woman who had been crying silently, her face still scarred by panic, now shivered with cold, but more so from the feeling of having been stripped of more than just her phone. The tears, the sighs, the trembling bodies, all that surrounded me, but no one said anything. The violence of those men did not need to be explained. It was as evident as the pain we all carried in our eyes. When the three men left, the silence became thick, heavy, denser than the rain itself that continued to pound the city. The bus continued on its way, but it was no longer the same. It was a moving machine, but to me, it seemed to be suspended in a void, as if it no longer had a purpose. Everything about it seemed more somber, more disturbing. The driver kept his gaze fixed forward, without looking at us, as if his work was just a routine that no longer mattered. No one cared about the destination. We were all worried about what had just happened and what would come next. I felt the pressure in my chest. I couldn't help but reflect on what had happened. As the bus drove through the flooded streets, I was lost in thought. Why didn't I do anything? My body had reacted as if it had frozen, as if the blows, the threats, were nothing more than a bad dream. Was it fear I felt, or simply a tacit surrender to the situation? I thought about the other passengers, about their lives, about what they would have lived up to that moment. We all shared that sense of vulnerability, of having been stripped not only of the material, but of something deeper, something intangible. Our trust in the world was gone, shattered by the brutality of strangers. Finally, the bus stopped at my stop. The sound of the brakes brought me out of my trance. I couldn't stop looking towards the door, as if I expected to see those three men getting off the bus to look for another victim, or maybe to give me one last look. But nothing happened. No one said a word as I stood up, as if each of us was immersed in our own thoughts, absorbed in the shared horror we had just experienced. As I stepped outside, the rain hit me hard, harder than I had ever felt before. The city in front of me looked different, as if everything that had been familiar was no longer familiar. The noise of the storm drowned everything out, and the smell of dampness and wet concrete enveloped me. But it wasn't enough to erase the feeling that had settled in my chest. I walked down the sidewalk, feeling my steps heavy and slow. I didn't know if it was the tiredness of what had happened, or something deeper that kept me still, almost paralyzed. That experience, that empty face of that man who watched me before leaving, haunted me. Why didn't he do anything to me? Perhaps because he had already seen something in me, a sign, a glimmer of weakness. Or maybe he simply decided that it was not worth killing me. What determined the life or death of a person? That silent gesture left me with an unanswered question. Arriving at my building, I took the elevator without looking at anyone. Everything seemed strange to me. The same door, the same walls, but nothing was the same anymore. How could I look at the world with the same eyes? That night, I could not sleep. The image of the three men kept echoing in my mind, but even more, what disturbed me was the feeling of being under constant surveillance, as if the whole world had been placed under a microscope, and now everything seemed more dangerous. The sense of the fragility of life was now unshakable in me. I no longer felt invincible or even safe. I began to see the city with different eyes, as if every street, every corner was waiting for something. As if the people around me could be someone completely different from what they appeared to be. Was this the reality? The idea that people could act like those men for no logical reason, simply out of the impulse to do harm, haunted me. The concept of safety began to fade. I wondered if it had ever, in reality, been safe to walk around the city, or if I had only fooled myself. The following days, although I tried to resume my routine, something had broken. My anxiety grew. I no longer took public transportation with the same nonchalance. Any shadow, any unexpected noise, filled me with alertness. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, about what had happened. Why did I survive and not the others? That question settled like a virus in my mind, but I never found a satisfactory answer. Somehow, I understood that life is fragile. The certainties of routine, the comfort of normality, are only mirages. We live in a world where chaos, violence, can arise out of nowhere. That was the real fear, the indifference of others, the ability to do harm without justification. We live surrounded by shadows, and sometimes we cannot know who the threat really is until it is too late. In life, the only thing we really possess is control over our own reaction to the violence around us. My life before Jesus came into our home was quiet. Fernanda and I lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, far enough away from the hustle and bustle, but not so distant that we lost connection with what was going on in the outside world. Nothing stood out in our routine. The days were the same, with their little problems and joys. But that all changed the day we decided to buy a new refrigerator. I remember it well. It was a Friday afternoon, it was raining hard, and the wind was whipping the windows with such force that they looked like they were about to shatter. We had been thinking about shopping for a while, as the one we had was not working well. It was the latest model from a reputable brand, modern, with all the features that made our lives easier. We decided to ask for a professional installation, and in a matter of days, a technician named Jesus arrived at our door. From the beginning, Jesus didn't seem to stand out. He was a middle-aged man, with the typical company uniform and a vacant look that did not bode ill. We received him kindly, not suspecting that this would be the last time our life would be normal. Fernanda, as usual, was busy with her things, while I was in charge of talking to the technician, telling him how I wanted the new refrigerator installed. Jesus had a polite attitude, but it was obvious that something in his behavior was beginning to seem strange. The first thing that struck me was his insistence on talking more than necessary. Every comment he made about the fridge was a pretext to lengthen the conversation, to stare longer at Fernanda and me. But it seemed so harmless, so usual for a man who spends all day talking about gadgets and appliances, that I let it go. The installation itself went without incident. However, when Jesus finished his work, he asked for a glass of water. At first, I thought it was simply politeness, but nervousness began to set in when I realized that his visit was not over, unlike that of any other technician. After a few minutes, Jesus said goodbye with a strange smile, as if he was looking for more than just an exit. Somehow, I felt he was looking at me as if he had decided to take possession of more than just our kitchen. What happened that night was the first thing that really made me worry. While we were in bed, already in the dark, we heard something. It was a soft sound, almost imperceptible, like a rubbing. Fernanda startled and looked at me with that look we share in moments of discomfort, without the need for words. I knew something was not right. I decided to get up and check the apartment, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The rain was still coming down hard, and the wind was still whipping at the windows, but the air in the apartment seemed to be getting thicker, as if something was pressing against the walls. The next day, I didn't think much about it. Jesus had done his job, and we had said our goodbyes. But when I went back to the fridge to get something to eat, I found a small piece of paper rolled up inside the compartment. I found them. They're mine. That was all it said. At first I thought it was a joke, but fear began to do its work when I realized it had been no one but him. At first, I didn't want to tell Fernanda. I didn't want to worry her, but fear infiltrated my thoughts. There was something in his gaze, in his insistence as he looked at us, that didn't fit with what was a simple job. The next day, the atmosphere became even more tense. Jesus began to appear in unexpected places and at unexpected times. Sometimes I would see him in the neighborhood, sometimes I would find him in the hallway of our building. He seemed to be getting closer and closer to us, and the discomfort grew with each of these encounters. That's when the first threats came. We were having dinner at the table when, again, we hear the doorbell ring. I open the door, and what I find makes me instinctively recoil. Standing in the doorway was Jesus. He was just standing there, not moving, with a vacant expression on his face. Without saying a word, he left me another piece of paper. This time it said, "You have been warned. You cannot hide." The sense of vulnerability that came over me at that moment was indescribable. Jesus was no longer just inside our home through his work. He had now infiltrated our lives, taken up residence in our thoughts. The authority the company gave him had been corrupted by something far more sinister. I began to realize that we were not just being stalked by a man, but by his obsession. We went to the police several times. Our reports of harassment and threats fell on deaf ears. The only advice we were given was to stop being so paranoid. The pressure was building up on us. Jesus was everywhere, always lurking, leaving ever more disturbing and ever closer notes. No one seemed to believe that our denunciations were anything more than an exaggeration, and the nightmare only intensified. There was no escape. No. I remember one day, weeks later, when I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that something was not right. The sound of the rain was unbearably loud, but what chilled my blood was seeing that on the window pane was something written. "I am patient. I know everything." I couldn't see from the window, but I felt he was outside, watching us, waiting. We started to move. First, we moved to a new apartment. But even in the new place, the letters kept appearing, with the same twisted message, with the same obsession. Within a couple of months, we moved again, but the feeling of being trapped, of being marked, was even more intense. Time passed, and the violence of the threats grew. One day, returning home from work, we found a letter under the door. This time there were no words, just a photograph of us, taken from outside our window. "They are mine now," said the signature at the bottom, in scrawled letters. We were no longer the same. Paranoia had worn us down. My arguments with Fernanda became more frequent, because she too felt the weight of fear. Uncertainty was eating away at us, and our once solid relationship began to falter. Every conversation became a conflict. Every gesture was misinterpreted. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and feel that she was watching through the window, hoping to see Jesus in the darkness. Was it possible that Jesus had some kind of power over us, that he was invisibly controlling us? It was a constant psychological torment, one that never ended, one that followed us even when we thought we had left it all behind. Even though we tried to seek help everywhere, the feeling that we were being watched never went away. Jesus was not pursuing us only through his physical presence. His presence was in our minds, in every dark corner of our existence. It was as if he had become part of our being, something we could never get rid of. Time passed with unbearable slowness. The weeks seemed to drag on, as if each day was a repetition of the previous one. Even though we moved apartments, even though we tried to escape, we never managed to get rid of the fear. Jesus had left a mark on us, a shadow in our lives that seemed to lengthen with every step we took. Even though we were in a new place, the echoes of his obsession followed us, like a nightmare that crept silently on the walls, on the doors, on the windows. Fernanda and I were no longer the same. The relationship we had before Jesus came into our lives was gone. What had once been a quiet, uneventful love had become a constant source of friction. She no longer looked at me the same way. Neither could I look at her without wondering if I really still trusted her, if I thought the same way I did before. The fear we shared had not only marked us, but also distanced us. Every time we went out, I felt that Jesus might be watching us. Where was he? We didn't know, but his notes kept appearing, always in places where we least expected them. Sometimes I would find them in the mailbox, sometimes in the window, or even on the front door. "I know what you do," said one of the last ones we found. Another, more disturbing, simply said, "You can't hide. I've found them." The most disturbing thing was that, try as we might, we could not escape him. Sometimes I felt there was something more to his words, as if it wasn't just us. How many other people had he stalked? What other victims would he have? Was he the same Jesus for everyone, or a figure who adapted to his victims according to what he needed? His threats never seemed to be empty. I always felt that he was in control, that somehow he knew more than we wanted to know. Somehow, in our obsession with fear, we began to adapt to it. Not consciously, of course, but our thoughts were dominated by it. Every strange noise, every shadow moving in the distance, made us hesitate. The sound of the rain hitting the windows was no longer soothing, but unsettling. It caught us in that feeling of constant vigilance, of knowing something was wrong, but not being able to pinpoint what it was. The rain was the backdrop to our distress. It was one particularly stormy night when something changed. That night, I decided that I could no longer live under this shadow. Fear had controlled us for so long that I could no longer stand it. The sound of the rain was so loud that it felt like the sky itself was going to collapse. It was a relentless storm, with the wind whipping through the city with a fury I had never experienced before. I thought that all this could be a form of deliverance. It was time to face Jesus, to confront the threat that had haunted us for so long. That night, after receiving a new letter under the door, I decided to do what I had never done before. I picked up the phone and called the police, asking them to come immediately. I needed to do it. I needed to act, even though I knew it wasn't going to be enough. Jesus had invaded our lives in such a way that I could no longer do anything to protect Fernanda or myself. When I reached the door, the air was tense, heavier than usual. It seemed that the wind had blown everything away, that the city itself had surrendered to the storm. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. The note, again, was there. This time the writing was even messier, more frantic. "They can never escape. They are trapped." Terror seized me at that moment, and I understood something much more terrifying than what we had experienced up to that moment. Jesus no longer needed to be physically near us to torment us. He had succeeded. He had entered our minds, our thoughts. The threat was not only his presence, but the constant sensation that he could appear at any moment. What had started as a simple harassment had become a psychological nightmare, a mental torture that we could not control. That night, I could not sleep. The shadows seemed to lengthen more than usual. Fernanda looked at me with exhausted eyes, but her fears were the same as mine. The only thing that changed was our ability to face them. Each of us had taken our own way of dealing with the anguish. How could we live like this? Fear turned into something else, distrust. We no longer trusted each other. Every time we went out, I wondered if I was really safe. Every shadow I saw in the distance could be him. Every person who crossed our path, as strange as it seemed, was a possible informant, a possible connection to the man who was stalking us. But we didn't know who the real enemy was. We were destroying each other without even realizing it. Months passed, and our life became even more unbearable. Jesus would no longer leave us alone even in the most intimate moments. His letters reached a point where we became afraid to open the door, afraid to even receive a phone call. But the worst was when we discovered that he wasn't just after us. When I finally reviewed the most recent letter, I discovered something that chilled my blood. In the photograph that accompanied the note, it was not only Fernanda and me. In the image, other faces were also visible. It was a photograph of a random place, with people we did not know. In the background, as if it were a list, there were more names written. I found them all. They are mine. It was then that I understood the magnitude of what we had been experiencing. Jesus was not just a stalker. He was a predator who fed on fear, who was driven by a dangerous obsession. His control was not only over our lives, but over our minds. Every thought, every place, every person was under his dominion, and his presence slowly ate away at us, not realizing how deeply we were being devoured. The police could not help us. The authorities still did not believe what we were experiencing. How could I explain it? How could I describe someone who no longer needed to be near us to control us? This was no longer a man who wanted our lives, but a man who had become an idea, a shadow that followed us relentlessly. I began to view the people around me with suspicion. Every conversation, every encounter, seemed a possible indication that someone was being manipulated, that Jesus had set his eyes on another victim. What had begun as an individual obsession had now become a web of control, a web we could not see, but which enveloped us in every corner of our lives. Jesus was not a human being. He was a concept, a fear that materialized everywhere. The reflection, although belated, was inevitable. How is it possible that one person can possess so much power over others? In our case, the real terror was not his physical presence, but the power of his influence, the power of a distorted mind that had found its prey. And worst of all, as we live under his shadow, we become the prison of our own fears. In the end, we realize that no matter how far we go, no matter how many times we change places, the real danger is not in what we see, but in what we cannot escape. The human mind has unlimited power to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary, the harmless into a deadly threat. And when we let fear take control, when we allow a single thought to become our reality, that is when we are truly lost. The greatest terror is not always in what we see or touch, but in what we cannot control. Fear, obsession, distrust, these are invisible forces that manipulate us, that transform us into shadows of what we once were. The real lesson is that, sometimes, the worst enemy is not the one that is outside, but the one that lives inside us. I have always been a shy guy, one of those who prefer to stay at home reading or surfing the internet, rather than going out to a bar or a party. Love and I were never great friends, or maybe I just never knew how to approach it. Over the years, dating apps became my refuge, conversations without commitment, where I could show a version of myself that rarely came out. However, even though my conversations were many, I never managed to land a date. The women I talked to would eventually fade away, and I would go back to my lonely routine, with an empty heart but no great expectations. Until one day, Carmen showed up. It was a short, direct, and curious message. I don't know what it was that drew me in immediately, but something about the way she wrote captured me. There was something unique about her, an energy I had not felt before. Her name, Carmen, resonated with a strange force in my mind, as if it were the beginning of something I didn't understand myself. She said she was French, that she lived in Paris, but she soon clarified that her life had taken her to various corners of the world. Her messages were profound, full of stories that sounded like something out of a novel. There was something about her manner that was so genuine, so confident that I was immediately drawn in. Distance didn't matter. In a matter of days, my thoughts revolved only around her. We started exchanging messages nonstop. Carmen would ask me about my dreams, my fears, my concerns. She told me about her life, her past, her travels. Sometimes her words seemed to make no sense, but I accepted them as part of her mystery, of her aura that slowly enveloped me. With each message, she made me feel like I was the only one in the world. The hours flew by, and I no longer thought about what my life had been like before I met her. Carmen had completely invaded my mind. It wasn't long before he asked for my number. It was one of those decisions that seemed so natural, so innocent. "I want to hear your voice. I feel so connected to you," she wrote. I, who had always been so reticent about sharing personal details, was overcome with emotion. I gave her my number. The first call was something different. His French accent gave a special touch to his voice, and I felt that every word he said penetrated me deeper. Sometimes the conversations would go on until the wee hours of the morning, as if we couldn't stop talking. There was something about Carmen that made me feel special, and although I wouldn't admit it out loud, I had fallen in love. I didn't know if it was the fact that she seemed to care about me in such a deep way, or if it was just the need for connection that I had always had. The thing is, the idea of meeting her in person began to hover in my mind, until one night, in the middle of one of our long talks, she said something that made me shudder. "I want to see you. I need you close. I have an idea for us." His proposal surprised me. "Come to Paris. Let's meet. I will make everything perfect. Trust me." Paris? I couldn't believe it. Carmen had achieved the unthinkable. A dream come true. The idea of being with her in such a romantic city filled me with excitement and fear at the same time. Without thinking too much about it, I accepted. The ticket was booked, the date set. The night before my flight was different. The rain falling heavily on my window seemed to portend something dark. My mind, which was mostly filled with happiness, was invaded by a little doubt. But it was too late. Everything had been decided. Arriving in Paris, the atmosphere was so charged that it could almost be cut with a knife. The city was wet, as if the rain had washed all the sins from its streets, leaving it vulnerable, exposed. I walked with my suitcase through the dark streets until I reached the place Carmen had indicated. The feeling that something wasn't right was running through me, but I couldn't put a name to it. Perhaps I was nervous in anticipation of our meeting. However, as I reached the apartment door, a lump in my throat grew stronger. Someone was watching me from the window. Even though it was dark, I could feel him. The door opened slowly. There was Carmen, just as I had imagined her, but there was something in her eyes that I didn't recognize. Something... I don't know how to describe it, but it wasn't the same person from our conversations. She smiled in a strange way, with some haste in her movements, as if she hoped I wouldn't notice her anxiety. "Welcome. It's time we really got to know each other, isn't it?" he said as he led me into the apartment. As I walked further in, the atmosphere became denser. The dim lights, musty smell, and rain pounding insistently on the windows created a claustrophobic atmosphere. Something wasn't right, but I kept going, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks. At first, everything seemed normal. Carmen was the same as in the calls and messages, but with each passing minute, something in her demeanor made me more uneasy. Her eyes, which used to sparkle in an attractive way, now seemed cold, empty. Her smile no longer had the same warmth. Suddenly, she started talking about things I didn't understand. How I was perfect for her. How I had been waiting so long for this moment. She was telling me things that seemed to bring out the worst in me, as if she knew my deepest secrets, my insecurities. But then, her tone changed. "You'll never leave. You're already here to stay. I promised." I didn't understand at the time what she meant by that. Why was she looking at me like that? Carmen started pacing back and forth, mumbling things about her plan, about how I could never escape, that she needed me by her side forever. It was then that I realized something terrible. Everything she had done up to that point was not out of love. It was out of control. She had been manipulating me from the beginning, playing on my emotions and my insecurities. The love I had thought I had found was nothing more than a trap. The night dragged on into a nightmare. There was no escape. I was trapped in his apartment, in a foreign city, with a woman I no longer recognized. Carmen had taken total control of the situation, and despair overcame me. I tried to get out, but every door was locked. Every window, too. The apartment looked like a prison, and Carmen's figure became bigger and bigger, more and more present. My mind could not stop spinning at what I had just discovered. I had been a victim of an unhealthy obsession. I felt completely helpless. What started as a simple desire to find some affection turned into a descent into a nightmare where love and control were confused, and I could no longer distinguish what was real. That night, the rain pounded hard on the windows of the apartment, as if it wanted to wash away everything inside. It was an incessant storm, a gale that gave no respite, as if nature itself wanted to join the nightmare that was crumbling inside the four walls of that place. I couldn't stop thinking about how strange it felt to be there. There was something in the air, in the atmosphere, that made me feel as if I was breathing a mixture of humidity and fear, something that could not be seen, but that I could perceive with every beat of my heart. Carmen had made it clear to me that she was not welcome in that apartment, at least not in the way I expected. At first, when I met her online, everything seemed so easy, so normal. Sometimes I wondered if this was all just a fantasy, an illusion created by my anxious mind, by my loneliness, by my desire to find something real. But what had started as an almost perfect emotional connection soon turned into something unsettling, something that was slipping through my fingers. When I asked him to explain his words on the first night, his response was evasive, as if he couldn't or wouldn't understand the damage he was causing. I felt a shudder when I saw that she no longer looked at me with that sweet gaze that had captivated me. Carmen now seemed like a different person. Every time I tried to speak, she would interrupt me with a wave of her hand, as if she didn't want me to talk about what had happened, about what we were experiencing. It seemed that the rules that had been established in our previous conversations no longer mattered. Everything around me was hers. The city, the room, the storm, everything had become hers. I was just a spectator, just another prisoner. Sitting on the couch, I watched as she moved from one side of the room to the other. With each step she took, the floor creaked under her weight. Her figure slipped into the shadows, and the dim light from the floor lamp barely illuminated her features. I no longer had the security he had given me through the messages. I no longer felt I had control over anything. Fear coursed through me, a primal fear that told me there was something fundamentally wrong, something that could not be solved by words alone. When I got up to go to the window, the rain seemed even heavier. The drops were falling hard on the glass, as if they were pounding angrily on the walls of the apartment. I looked down, trying to think clearly, trying to understand how I had gotten to that point, how I had allowed something so small, so innocent to have brought me there. Carmen was not the woman I had met on dating apps. The person who had been behind those lovely messages was no longer there. She had transformed into something else, something more dangerous, something I didn't fully understand. At first, when she told me she wanted us to go further, I thought she meant a deeper relationship, a more real connection. But what I discovered that night was that she didn't want a relationship at all. It was a dark and wet afternoon. The rain was hitting the truck's windshield with an almost supernatural force, as if the sky wanted to force us to stop. The vehicle's lights cut through the curtain of water falling from the sky, but little by little, visibility became scarcer, and fatigue began to invade me. Samuel, my coworker, and I had been driving for hours, hauling high-end motorcycles in our cargo truck. The destination, a distant city, where we were to deliver the goods. But the road seemed endless. We both knew well what the job entailed. Long hours behind the wheel, few stops, the constant stress of keeping the goods safe and arriving on time. However, something in the air that night told me something was about to change. The lights of the cars speeding by, the sticky humidity, the sound of the rain that kept hitting the metal of the cab. It all seemed too thick, as if the atmosphere itself was trying to warn us of what was to come. Samuel was the kind of person who always remained calm in the most complicated situations. While I was trying to concentrate on the road, he had this way of observing everything with an eerie serenity. Years of working together had taught me to trust his judgment, but even he seemed quieter that night. I don't know if it was tiredness or that strange feeling that enveloped us, but something told us that we were not alone on that desolate road. We had been driving in the storm for more than 3 hours when Samuel, after a long silence, broke the stillness of the cabin. "What do you say we stop for a while?" he asked, even though he knew we didn't need to. I was exhausted, but I also knew there was something in his tone that puzzled me. It was as if not only was he tired, but he also sensed something strange. Without thinking too much about it, I nodded my head. We stopped at a lonely rest area, with nothing but darkness and the sound of rain for company. The truck's lights glowed dimly, and the sound of the drops hitting the vehicle's sheet metal felt like a constant pressure. Samuel leaned back in his seat, and I unwillingly fell into a deep sleep. The heaviness of the storm and the adrenaline of the trip had lulled me into a restless sleep. I woke up a few hours later, with a feeling of discomfort that I couldn't explain. The sky was darker than I had left it, and the rain, now an almost unstoppable torrent, continued to lash the truck. Samuel was no longer in his seat. At first, I wasn't too concerned, as he would sometimes get out to stretch a bit, or walk along the side of the road. But when I looked out the window of the truck, I noticed that something wasn't right. There was no trace of Samuel. Fear immediately enveloped me. I got out of the truck with my heart racing, looking at every corner of the area, but there was no sign of him. The only sound that broke the silence was the roar of the storm. I walked a few meters to the edge of the road, looking in all directions, but everything was deserted. The rain was blurring the visibility, and the truck's lights seemed to be out in the fog. It was then that I saw what I didn't want to see. Tire tracks, fresh in the mud of the road. It couldn't be. Someone had moved the truck. I felt the knot in my stomach as I hurried back to the vehicle. It had been left there, parked in a lonely spot, and now something, or someone, had taken Samuel. The tires had sunk a bit in the mud, but the footprint was clear. The truck had been towed. The feeling of being watched became more intense. I began to feel a pressure on my chest. I looked back anxiously, but I saw no one, only shadows distorted by the rain. I was alone. Too alone. I walked the distance between the truck and the roadside, the sense of dread growing with each step. Finally, I found what I had feared. Samuel's phone, lying on the ground, its screen cracked and its casing dented. Unable to help myself, my body tensed. Something horrible had happened. At that moment, the sound of an engine starting paralyzed me. I wasn't crazy. I could hear it. It was a truck engine, a low, low sound, creeping through the thunder and rain. My feet instinctively moved to the edge of the road, looking for the source of the noise, but there was no vehicle in sight. The sound died away as quickly as it had started. Then I knew. Someone had hijacked the truck and Samuel, and I was just a victim in the same trap. My mind began to process what was going on. We had a lot of high-end bikes in the truck, bikes worth a fortune, and someone knew we were going to be there that night. The robbery wasn't random. It was planned. Not only had they taken the truck, they had taken Samuel, and they were probably waiting for me. The rain was pounding harder, as if trying to drown my thoughts. I couldn't stand there. I couldn't wait. I had to act fast. If they had followed the same path, the truck was probably not too far away. She wanted something much darker, something that involved control, manipulation, and an unhealthy obsession that I couldn't see the full extent of until I was already too caught up in it. Everything I had thought about our relationship, about the possibility of being happy with her, vanished. Carmen had turned me into her prisoner without my realizing it. Every time I tried to talk about my doubts, my fears, she would interrupt me. With an empty smile, she would tell me that there was no need to worry, that everything would be fine, that I just needed to trust her. But her words were meaningless. They weren't the same words as before, the ones that made me feel safe. Now they were just lies. Her eyes, once full of sweetness, had become cold, calculating. I no longer saw the woman I had known. I was facing a stranger. It was at that moment that it all made sense. She wasn't interested in me. My company meant nothing to her. She just wanted to control me, to dominate me, to make me hers in an unhealthy, possessive way. It was then that I realized I had been a pawn in a game I didn't even know existed. The night continued its course, and Carmen did not stop moving around, more and more restless. When I got up to approach her, the light of the lamp illuminated something that had gone unnoticed until then, a box on the table. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I could see it clearly. It was closed, but something told me I shouldn't open it. Fear had begun to consume me completely. "What's in that box?" I couldn't help but ask, even though the answer was already niggling at the back of my mind. Carmen looked at me for a long moment, and then her lips curved into a strange smile. She walked over to the table, picked up the box, and slowly opened it. Inside were several papers. They were all written in quick, messy handwriting. Notes, letters, photos. Suddenly, everything became even more terrifying. They were pictures of me, taken without my permission. Pictures I had thought were private. There were details of my life that I had never told her, information that no one else could know. Carmen looked me straight in the eyes, expressionless. "Did you realize what you've done, sweetheart?" Her voice sounded almost like a whisper, but every word was a thump in my chest. "Did you think I could be any different? I knew you were the one. I knew you couldn't escape." Terror, like an electric current, ran through me from head to toe. She had been watching me all along. From the beginning, from those first messages, every word I had said to her, every detail I had shared, had been recorded and used against me. Suddenly, I felt completely trapped. There was no way out. The storm was still raging outside, but here, inside this dark apartment, the storm was even fiercer. I could not escape its eyes, its control. I had become a piece in her chess, and she had already moved all the pieces. In that instant, I realized that my life would never be the same again. Fear enveloped me completely, like a blanket I couldn't take off. Carmen had slowly destroyed me, unseen by me, and now I didn't know how to stop her. Every part of my being wanted to run away, but I knew I could no longer. The next day, when the storm subsided and daylight came through the windows, my mind was still trapped in the darkness of what had happened. I couldn't understand how I had gotten there, how I had allowed someone else to control me like that. But worst of all, what terrified me more than anything else, was knowing that I never knew who Carmen really was. She didn't even know herself. What seemed to be a deep connection, what appeared to be the love I had always sought, turned out to be a lie. Obsession and control are more powerful forces than love, and once someone enters your mind, it is almost impossible to free yourself from their influence. I learned too late that love is not possession, it is not control. Love must be free. The greatest enemy is not in the shadows, but in the minds that try to manipulate us. And sometimes, the worst prison we can create is the one we build for ourselves, by allowing someone else to control our being. The next time love knocks on my door, I will know how to recognize it, but I will also know how to distinguish it from the lies that come disguised as affection. But at the same time, fear kept me from moving forward. The field was desolate. If I tried to go through that terrain, I could get lost, or worse, fall directly into the trap they had prepared for me. Something inside me told me that there was no turning back. Not only had I lost Samuel, but I had entered a game where the only rule was to survive. And at that moment, something as simple as breathing seemed like a challenge. The air was thick, heavy, and the rain didn't let up. The sound of the drops hitting the ground, the truck and nearby rocks became a deafening echo that made me feel like I was trapped inside a giant drum. Every time I walked, the sound of my footsteps added to the chaos, creating a strange, oppressive symphony of discomfort. The storm had worsened, and with it, my sense of isolation and fear grew worse by the minute. The truck was parked a few meters from where I was standing, but something inside me told me that I shouldn't approach it right away. Something was not right. The rain was still pouring down steadily, and visibility was almost zero. However, the road seemed quiet, almost empty, a strange contrast to the feeling of dread I felt. How had it come to this? How could it be that, after so many years of working in this trade, I found myself in the middle of a storm, not knowing what had happened to Samuel? Do you have any idea who might be behind all this? The sound of the engine was approaching. It was low and low, like the roar of a beast in the distance. I could hear it over the thunder, as if someone was driving a heavy vehicle through the mud. My first impulse was to hide, but I could not. I knew that if I did, I would lose any chance of finding answers, of regaining what I had lost. I couldn't just stand there waiting for fate to decide my future. The storm was getting worse by the second. The rain was falling with such fury that the ground seemed to turn into a river. Despite the bad weather, the road was still deserted. There were no traffic signs, no lights of approaching vehicles. Only the sound of the storm accompanied me. Suddenly, I realized that I was completely alone, completely vulnerable. Was Samuel somewhere on that road? Or had he been taken somewhere else? The roar of the engine suddenly died away, and the ground beneath my feet vibrated slightly. The sound had stopped, but something told me that something else was going on. A strange feeling of being watched enveloped me. I turned quickly, looking for someone in the darkness, but saw nothing. Only the rain, the wind, and the shadows of the trees moving violently in the wind. There was no one, at least not in sight. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard a whisper, an almost inaudible sound amidst the roar of the storm. It was the sound of tires on mud, sliding smoothly. Someone was driving very close to me. Something inside me told me that I should run away, that I shouldn't stay there waiting for everything to be resolved. But I couldn't move. My legs seemed anchored to the ground, and a paralyzing fear gripped me. I knew I had entered a much bigger game than I had imagined. This robbery was no accident. It wasn't just a cargo truck with high-end motorcycles. It was something much more personal. Someone was looking for more than just the bikes. Someone was looking for us. Reality hit me with the force of lightning. Samuel and I weren't just victims of a robbery. We were pieces in a game I didn't even understand. The rain didn't stop, but the noise of the engine was getting louder and louder. I didn't have much time left. If I didn't do something soon, I would end up like Samuel, if he was still alive. The sound of the engine died away again, and a silent pressure settled in my chest. Where were they? What did they want with me? At first I thought it was just a common robbery, but now I knew there was something more sinister going on. I no longer felt safe even inside my own body. Every move I made, every step I took seemed like a provocation. I turned again, but this time I didn't see the lights of the vehicle. Only the storm, the wind, and the shadows that lengthened with every clap of thunder that shook the sky. What if they were already surrounding me? Samuel's phone. The phone. I ran toward the truck, adrenaline bombarding my brain as raindrops lashed my face. Each step seemed slower to me, as if the storm wanted to hold me back, as if the darkness of the surroundings was slowly sucking me in. Once I reached the truck, I quickly searched inside the cab, checking the table and the seats in desperation. Nothing. Suddenly, something made me turn around. I was not alone. A pair of lights shone in the distance, reflected in the water on the ground, like a pair of eyes watching me from a distance. My heart skipped a beat, and a cold sweat ran down my back. They were here. Without further thought, I darted into the shadows, looking for some kind of shelter among the trees or at the edge of the field. I needed to find somewhere where I could see without being seen. I needed to figure out what was going on before it was too late. I knew that if I stood there waiting for someone to show up, I would not only be endangering myself, but I might also be dooming Samuel. I crept through the undergrowth, moving cautiously, trying not to make a sound. The rain was pounding furiously, but the shadows offered me some cover. I didn't dare look back. I only listened to the sound of the approaching lights. Fear enveloped me with every step I took, but anger, desperation, and the need to find my partner remained at the forefront of my thoughts. I couldn't let it end like this. I couldn't lose Samuel. Suddenly, I heard something that froze me in place. The sound of a door slamming. A vehicle had parked near where I was standing. I had no more time. I got up quickly, without making a sound, and slid into a crevice in the ground. From there, I could see the road, and also, more importantly, I could see the truck. I watched as two men got out of a black van and approached the vehicle stealthily, as if they were used to moving in the dark. But what left me paralyzed was what I saw next. One of them was holding something in his hand, a weapon. I kept the feeling that the air was being expelled from my lungs. I couldn't stay there. It was now or never. But I couldn't do anything. I knew that if I tried anything, they would react before I could even move. My only hope was that there was still some of Samuel left, some of the hope we had shared all those years. If I could figure out what they wanted, if I could find some clue, maybe I could save him. But something told me that this wasn't just an ordinary robbery. There was no turning back now. As I remained hidden, waiting for the storm to calm down before making a move, I understood something that chilled me inside. They had not only stolen our truck, they had stolen our freedom, our security. We had been turned into pieces, as if our lives were mere chess pieces in a game we didn't understand. Life had somehow trapped us in a net woven by invisible hands. And worst of all, although my mind was alert, my body remained a prisoner of fear. Control was no longer in our hands. It was an ordinary December day, like any other. The hours passed quietly, and the rains that were beginning to fall on the city only slowed down the traffic. I, Mauricio Perez, manager of a canned tuna distributor, was in the office, as usual, organizing the tasks for the next day. The work, though demanding, was something I already knew well, and in an industry as structured as ours, the days tended to follow a predictable routine. That day was no different. The hours passed quietly, until the afternoon began to darken, and the storm was raging. As the rain began to fall harder, I decided it was time to leave the office. The usual 6:30 p.m. traffic took longer than expected, and the humidity in the air only made my impatience worse. My truck, one of those that makes you feel invulnerable, glistened in the rain. After all, I had acquired it with a lot of effort, a symbol of my professional success and stable life. I never imagined that my world would change that night. Taking one of the less traveled roads to avoid the usual traffic jams, I came across a police roadblock. It was not an unusual sight on the highways, and as usual, I stopped to have my documents checked. News of the storm was playing on the radio, and the light from the patrol car's headlights illuminated the pouring rain. Everything seemed normal. However, something in the atmosphere did not convince me. When I stopped, I saw 3 men in uniform. Their posture was somewhat strange, more relaxed than one would expect from a security checkpoint. Their uniforms were slightly wet, but instead of an air of authority, there was something about them that made me uneasy, although I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. The first of them, a man with a strong build, approached my window and asked for my documents. The rain was falling heavily, and the sound of the drops hitting the glass enveloped me. There was a moment when an uneasy feeling came over me. but I quickly dismissed it as simple paranoia. I handed them the driver's license and the vehicle papers. Everything seemed to be moving along, but something didn't fit. The other two men watched silently, their gazes fixed, almost too intense to be so casual. I thought maybe I was being paranoid, that it was all part of routine procedure. But then, the man standing near my window changed his tone. His eyes no longer resembled those of an officer. His expression was expressionless, empty, as if something was missing in his gaze. I wasn't sure what was going on, but at that moment his attitude began to give me a sense of insecurity, something I had never experienced in a situation like that. Should I do something? I wondered. But the instinct not to question authority kept me silent. My heart began to beat faster. I knew something wasn't right, but the idea that something so dangerous could be happening in such a normal place was almost absurd. It had all happened so fast, so without warning, that I had no time to process it. The first of the men signaled me to get out of the vehicle. At that moment, my body reacted instinctively. Something was not right. However, the second officer, whom I had barely paid attention to before, moved quickly to close the car door. A hint of panic crept into my mind. The situation was not normal. Something was brewing, but my thoughts were interrupted by a clear signal. I had to get out of the car. Why? I had no idea. Everything was becoming confusing. However, instead of responding, I kept still. At that instant, my eyes met those of one of the men, and something in his gaze changed. It was as if he was reading me, as if he knew what I was thinking, as if he had been waiting for that moment. Somehow the atmosphere became oppressive. I felt completely vulnerable, trapped in a cycle of distrust. The three men did not say another word, but their gestures were enough for me to understand that this was no longer a simple security check. They had caught me. Somehow, inexplicably, the men backed away without another word. I stood there, petrified, feeling my whole body tremble. Something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was. After a few moments that seemed like hours, the men turned around and began walking toward a vehicle that had been left parked on the road. My breathing began to normalize, but the tension was still there, palpable. With trembling hands, I grabbed the steering wheel and started the engine. The van roared to life, and the sound of the engine overtook the rumbling of the storm. Fear had paralyzed me, and although the lights of the patrol car quickly disappeared behind me, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, fearing that something was about to happen. What had happened? Had I been mistaken? Was it just a bad omen? Uncertainty came over me, and as I drove down the road, something inside me told me that this night would not end the same as all the others. When I finally left behind the police cars and the patrol cars, a dense air took over the van. The road seemed to stretch indefinitely under the curtain of rain that kept falling. Visibility was scarce, but the feeling of vulnerability that enveloped me was much sharper than any fog. Something had changed in me. I did not know exactly what, but the fear that had seized me at that moment remained as a shadow that would not leave me alone. My mind kept going over what had happened, trying to find a rational explanation for everything that had happened. Questions piled up in my head, but none seemed to have an answer. Why did those men behave in such a strange way? Why didn't they do anything when it was completely within their reach? There was something in their behavior that told me I wasn't dealing with ordinary policemen. Their gestures, their blank stares, the fact that they didn't follow normal protocol, all indicated to me that something was amiss. But I couldn't afford to get caught up in that thought. I was on my way home. Nothing else mattered at that moment. Every kilometer I went, the silence weighed more heavily on me. The van's engine roared loudly, cutting the sound of the rain hitting the metal roof. From time to time, the windshield would wipe away the accumulated drops, but they would soon form again. The sound of the storm, incessant, made everything around me feel more claustrophobic. The world outside seemed to have vanished under the curtain of water. My thoughts were beginning to spin in circles, unable to find a clear end. From time to time, I would look in the rearview mirror. At first, I did it out of habit, but then I felt something inside me urge me to do it. as if I expected to see something or someone. Paranoia had begun to take over. What if those men were still following me? What if something much more sinister was happening at that moment? The road seemed endless, and the darkness, fueled by the rain, didn't help calm my nerves. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, the glow of the lights of the other vehicles, which I could barely make out in the distance, seemed more distant. Time seemed to drag on, and the images of those men kept replaying over and over in my mind. That empty stare, that feeling that something was not right, all that haunted me. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I made it to an intersection. My home was not far, but my body felt exhausted, as if I had been driving all my life. Fatigue came over me, but so did a sense of relief, as if it was all about to end. However, as I approached the city, a strange feeling of discomfort came over me again. What if I was still being followed? What if, for some reason, there was something much darker waiting at the end of the road? I decided not to risk it. I sped up a little, aware that my head could not stop analyzing every detail, every shadow on the road. But despite my effort to escape from those thoughts, the feeling that I was not alone was still present. It was hard to put into words what I was feeling. I was distressed, yes, but there was something else. A kind of emptiness, as if the experience I had lived through had left me marked in a way I could not yet understand. I could not stop thinking about what had happened to me, about what had been taken from me in those minutes. My security, my peace of mind, everything was gone. The rain did not let up, and the city lights in the background seemed farther away than ever. When I got home, the door closed with a dull sound that echoed in my mind. I was safe, or so I wanted to believe. But, as I left the sound of the engine behind, the feeling of insecurity remained. I sat down on the couch, letting out a sigh. I thought about telling my wife what had happened, but something inside me told me I shouldn't. It was a hard story to believe, even for me. It was a hard story to believe, even for me. How would I explain to her that I had been the victim of something so strange? That my life had been put at risk by some guys who looked like cops, but had no real authority to do so? I decided not to say anything. I was not ready to face that reality. But the feeling of being watched, of always being on the alert, would no longer leave me alone. What had really happened that night? My mind kept going round and round about it, but at the same time, I couldn't help wondering how easy it was to be fooled. What if those men were part of something bigger? What if the city wasn't as safe as I had always thought? The worst came days later. Over the course of the week, that uncertainty began to take hold of me in more subtle ways. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched, but the way my every move seemed to be under surveillance. The days became longer and the nights more restless. I began to think there was something in the street, in the cars that passed me, in the shadows of the nearby park. It was as if I couldn't trust anything or anyone. Everything seemed to have a double face, and everything I thought I knew about security and order was falling apart. My wife, who had noticed something strange about my behavior, insisted that I talk about what had happened, but my answer was always the same. It's nothing, just a bad time. The pressure to remain calm was eating me up inside. Worst of all, what terrified me the most was the recurring thought that I could not get out of my mind. What would have happened if I had not been so alert? Time has passed since that night, but the truth is that nothing has ever been the same. I have learned not to blindly trust situations, to always keep my guard up, even if it seems irrational. My outlook on life changed irrevocably after that experience. That false sense of security that routine sometimes gives us was shattered in one fell swoop. Now I understand that danger does not always come in the way we expect it. It is not always obvious. It is not always physical. Risk may be disguised under a facade that seems harmless, and people who seem trustworthy may not be what they appear to be. Today, I am more cautious. I don't stop anywhere or trust easily. I always question everything, from the people around me to situations that once seemed safe to me. Perhaps the greatest danger is not in what we see, but in what we don't want to see. What happened to me that night not only changed the way I see the world, but also the way I think about trust and security. I now know that even in the most ordinary moments of our lives, we must be prepared for the unexpected. Because what seems harmless to us can be much more dangerous than we imagine. The lesson is clear. Security is an illusion. And sometimes trusting what seems safe is the biggest risk we take. I never imagined that my family's life would change in a single night. There was something unsettling in the air those days, although I couldn't identify it at the time. As the manager of a canned tuna distribution company, my daily life was a back and forth between meetings, reports, and the usual routine. My brother, Juan Marcos, had always been a central figure in my life, 4 years older than me, but with a natural leadership ability that sometimes intimidated me. He was always the one who advised me, the one who made the decisions, the one who brought order to my chaotic days. I knew him well. At times he seemed invincible, unstoppable, the steadiest piece of our family. But as often happens, life throws you surprises that even those closest to you can't anticipate. I got the worst one of all. It was December 14th, a Friday afternoon. The day had been hectic, as usual, with more calls than I could handle. However, despite the fatigue, I felt that something was wrong. A vague feeling, hard to describe, but strong enough to keep me pensive for a few minutes. Perhaps it had been the conversation with Juan Marcos the night before. I had noticed in his tone of voice a hint of something inexplicable, something I could not identify, but I gave it little importance, as it usually happens with intuitions that we do not know how to process. That night, when I got home, I was surprised to find it empty. It was not normal. My mother, father, and sister had already had dinner, as usual, and the table was set. But Juan Marcos was not there. I thought that maybe he had stayed home to work, or that he had gone out with a friend, which was not unusual. However, as the hours passed, anxiety began to take hold of me. I called his cell phone, but there was no answer. I didn't panic at the time. I thought he must have forgotten to charge the battery or was busy. But then, as the hours passed, I started to worry. The next morning, I still hadn't heard from him. It was then that my mother called me. Her voice was shaking strangely, and when she told me she hadn't seen Juan Marcos since the night before, I knew something wasn't right. I called all his friends. I checked his room. I searched every corner of the house. Nothing. There was no sign of him. The disappearance of Juan Marcos soon became a central issue for everyone. The police began to investigate, but at first they had no clues. There was something puzzling about his disappearance. No trace, no phone call, nothing that could give us a clue as to what had happened. For the first few days, I thought it was some kind of temporary escape. Perhaps a fight or something as trivial as an argument with an acquaintance. But as the hours passed, a much more frightening reality dawned on me. After 14 days, the police had done everything in their power. Searches continued, but progress was nil. The case went from a disturbing disappearance to a desperate search with no results. We were completely lost. That's when, late in the afternoon, we received an anonymous text message. At the time, I thought it was a cruel prank, something someone had done to torment our family. But what I read chilled my blood. He deserved it. There was no more text. Just those 5 words, simple but shuddering, that went round and round in my head. What did they mean? Who had sent that message? And most frightening of all, why did they say that about John Mark? My mind began to wander in every possible direction. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was trying to manipulate us, some kind of psychological message. However, something inside me, a hunch I couldn't help but feel, told me it wasn't a joke. The message was too direct, too cold. It wasn't just a stranger playing on our anguish. It was about something else. The problem was that no one knew what. From that moment on, the direction of my life was transformed. I couldn't stop thinking about what that message implied. He deserved it. What had my brother done? I was reluctant to believe that John Mark was involved in something that could lead him to that situation. I couldn't understand it. The only way forward was to look for more clues, to follow the trail, even if it was dangerous. I decided to take matters into my own hands. While the police continued their investigation, I, as an older brother, could not stand by. I could not wait for someone else to solve what, for me, was a personal tragedy. I needed to find Juan Marcos, to understand what had happened, why he had disappeared, and above all, why that message. No matter how much time I had to invest in the search, I would do it. I felt that if I didn't do it, if I didn't take control of the situation, I would probably never get answers. It was a gray afternoon. The rain was falling heavily on the city, covering the streets with a layer of water that seemed to mimic my emotional state. At that precise moment, I decided to start the investigation on my own. I knew I couldn't do it alone. The police had their own methods, but something told me that official resources were not enough to uncover the truth. At first, I tried to get more information by asking Juan Marcos's friends. However, they all seemed as surprised as I was. No one knew anything. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but the more I dug, the more I realized that I didn't know my brother as well as I thought I did. I had no idea what he had been doing for the past few months. One day, while going through his room, I discovered something that chilled my heart. In his desk drawer, I found a series of notes and newspaper clippings. Some were of unsolved crimes, others of mysterious events, even kidnappings. It was as if my brother had been investigating something. But what? Why hadn't he told me anything? Why hadn't he shared it with me? I found this series of notes puzzling. As the hours passed and the rain continued to fall relentlessly over the city, I realized that my brother had been immersed in something much darker than I had imagined. Something that, at that moment, I could no longer stop. I didn't know it yet, but that message, that disconcerting phrase, had been just the beginning of a spiral of terror and despair. My brother, it seemed, had not only disappeared, but had also fallen into the clutches of something that had transformed him. And I, in trying to save him, was about to risk not only his life, but mine, and that of my family. The hours passed slowly as I walked through the streets one by one, following my brother's trail. The rain, which wouldn't stop falling, no longer mattered to me. I was soaked to the bone, but my mind couldn't stop thinking about what was happening. He deserved it. The phrase echoed over and over in my head like a mantra. Something inside me knew I wasn't going to find the truth easily or quickly, but my determination grew as I went forward, never stopping. The first clue I found was on her cell phone. After cracking the password he had left his phone with, I discovered a series of disturbing messages. The messages were full of names I didn't recognize, and the conversations, which at first seemed banal, soon revealed a network of people with dark intentions. He had spoken to them on several occasions, although he had never mentioned anything to the family. One of the messages, dated a few days before his disappearance, said something like, "Deal closes this weekend. See you at the old warehouse." The old warehouse. That was the first concrete clue. It didn't take me long to realize that my brother was involved in something much more dangerous than I imagined. The more I read, the clearer it became that the people he was involved with were not someone he was simply friends with. There was something more to it. What kind of deal was he making? The question was getting harder and harder to answer, but what was clear was that my brother was trapped in a world of his own making, and I didn't know how he got there. I decided to go to the location I had mentioned in the messages, the old warehouse. There was something in the description that made me uneasy. I knew I couldn't go alone, but the urgency of the situation pushed me to act quickly. I didn't want to waste any more time. I was so blinded by the need to find my brother that I didn't realize the dangers that lurked ahead. As I approached the depot, the sound of the rain hitting the asphalt became louder, almost deafening. Visibility was limited. The lights of my car barely illuminated the road that led me to that desolate place. The air was cold and dense, as if humidity was invading every corner of my body. The building, large and dilapidated, stood before me like a gray giant that had been forgotten by time. The broken windows and rickety structure gave it an even more disturbing air. I parked at a safe distance, partly because the place seemed uninhabited, but also because the feeling that something was not right filled me with distrust. At that moment, fear settled in my chest, but the need for answers drowned it out. I didn't know if my brother was inside, if he had already been taken out, or if I had fallen into a trap. Still, I decided to move forward. The warehouse doors were closed, but they were no more than a formality. With a push, I pushed them open, the creak of the hinges echoing in the stillness of the night. The interior of the building was darker than I had imagined. A mixture of damp, dust, and the metallic smell of corrosion filled the air. A few rays of light filtered through the cracks, barely illuminating the vast empty space. The first thing that caught my attention were the footprints on the floor. They were fresh, which meant that someone had been there recently. I followed the trail cautiously, moving among the debris and old forgotten furniture. Every step I took seemed amplified by the silence that surrounded the place. I was alone, but I felt that someone was watching me, lurking. The feeling was so intense that, for a moment, I stopped to listen. Nothing. Just the sound of my breathing and the sound of the rain hitting the roof. Finally, I reached a room at the back of the warehouse. The door was locked, but when I pushed it, it opened without difficulty. Inside, a dim light came from an old lamp. My brother was not alone. At first, I didn't recognize him. There was something different about him, something in his gaze that chilled my blood. He was standing there, his eyes empty, as if his soul had been ripped from his body. His hands were stained with what appeared to be ink, but there was something on his face that I couldn't identify. There was something about him that was no longer my brother. When he saw me, his eyes seemed to light up for a second, but the expression that appeared on his face was completely alien to the one he used to have. He was surrounded by dark figures, people he didn't know. His gaze was fixed, cold, and there was no trace of the warmth he had always shown. His face, usually kind and protective, had been transformed into a mask. I could not understand how he had gotten there, but the fact that he no longer recognized me devastated me. I felt as if time had stopped at that moment. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was short of breath. I knew that what I had found was not my brother, but a version of him, a completely different person who was caught up in something much bigger than me. Something so dangerous that even my own brother didn't seem able to comprehend. I realized I was in the middle of a maze, with no way out, and fear choked me. The shadows of the surrounding people did not move. They remained static, watching me. There was something sinister in their presence, something that told me that this place, this building, was not just a shelter, but a control center. What was really going on? At that instant, a figure approached me. It was not one of the people around him, but someone else. His face was covered with a hood, but his eyes were shining in a way that made my blood run cold. I didn't need to hear his voice to know what was going on. My brother had been involved in something much bigger, something he couldn't undo. And I, for some reason, was now trapped too. I began to back away slowly, without taking my eyes off my brother. He didn't move a muscle. He didn't try to approach me. He didn't make a single gesture. It was as if he was completely detached from reality, lost in a world I could not understand. And suddenly, I realized that the only way I could save my brother and myself was to get out of there before it was too late. The truth, though unsettling, hit me at that moment. I could no longer save my brother. I was trapped in a game I could not escape. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on my brother, until I finally managed to get out of the warehouse. The rain, which had not yet stopped, seemed to have intensified. I felt exhausted, defeated. At that moment, I understood that I was not alone in this search. My brother was no longer the same. and all that remained was an echo of what might have been. What I experienced that night changed my life forever. We are not always able to safeguard the people we love. Sometimes they themselves plunge into the abyss without us realizing it. And in trying to save them, we can lose everything. The truth is that my brother was no longer there. He had been replaced by something I could not understand, and the search to find him plunged me into a spiral of despair and fear. But in the end, the lesson was clear. There is no way to save someone who does not want to be saved. My life changed on July 14th, 2023. That day, the rain pounded furiously on the windows of my house, and the darkness of dusk seemed to take on more force than ever. It was not just any day. Estrelita, my cat, my companion, was at home, and I, in my usual routine of getting off work and resting, did not suspect in the least that everything was about to turn into a nightmare. Estrelita was special to me. I had recently adopted her, a small, furry, and energetic little being. She was only 2 months old, but her presence at home had given me more companionship than the years I had spent in the city. She was always playful, and her snow-white fur glistened in the sunlight as she played in the garden. Every morning, her soft meow would wake me up, as if to tell me that the day was beginning, that there was still something to do, something to live for. She was my only friend, the only person who didn't make me feel so lonely in this world full of noise and stress. My daily life went smoothly, without many surprises. I worked as a manager in a company, which, although demanding, did not leave me much time to interact with other people. The neighborhood where I lived was quiet. Everything seemed fine, too fine. But what happened that day completely upset that false sense of security. I arrived home after a long day at work, with the rain falling in gray curtains outside the window. Estrelita, as usual, was not waiting for me at the door. I thought she would be in the garden, playing among the plants or looking for something in the little corner where she used to sleep. However, when I entered, something was not right. A strange silence enveloped me as I opened the door. I was so used to hearing her scampering and meowing throughout the house that the absence of these sounds unsettled me. I decided to call out to her with a simple whisper of her name, but there was no response. In the distance, the sound of rain lashing against the window seemed to deafen everything else. My heart began to race for no apparent reason. I headed for the backyard, hoping to find her there. My mind thought of 1,000 excuses not to worry. Perhaps she was playing in some corner of the yard, as she always did, or maybe she had just decided to sleep a little longer. However, as I crossed the threshold of the garden, something stopped me. There, in the same place where Estrelita always ran, I saw her. Her little body was lying on the ground, motionless, under the rain that was falling like a gray blanket. The sight chilled my blood. Estrelita was not moving, her eyes open, but empty, fixed on something I could not see. She was in a strange posture, as if she had suddenly collapsed, without a single meow, without a single movement. The rain beat down on his body with the same indifference with which it fell on the rest of the world. As I approached, a feeling of despair enveloped me, as if the gravity of the moment was crushing me. The air around me became thick and difficult to breathe. I could do nothing but stand there, eyes riveted on his lifeless body, wondering what had happened. The little cat that had been my light in the dark days now lay dead in the garden, and I didn't know why. No one had warned me. My mind was clouded with confusion. How had she gotten there? What had happened in such a short time? I thought maybe an accident had struck her, but something inside me knew it wasn't that. When I bent down to touch her, looking for some sign of life, something strange happened. A small piece of paper appeared next to her body, almost imperceptible, flattened by the moisture. My hands trembled as I took it. The rain continued to fall mercilessly, but my eyes could only focus on the words written on that piece of paper. The red ink looked fresh, but something about it made me gag. "You continue." My fingers twitched on the paper and my mind went blank for a moment. The air became thick and heavy. That sentence, so simple and so terrifying, chilled my soul. What did it mean? Who could have done this to Estrelita? And worst of all, who was sending me that message? Fear began to seize me, like a wild animal taking over everything. How could anyone harm such an innocent, fragile being? My little cat, who had no enemies, who only cared about her games and her nap on my lap. Why her? Why her? Why now? That night the rain did not stop. It seemed that the whole world was in tune with my anguish, with my helplessness. The feeling that someone was watching me, someone who knew what had happened, surrounded me like a thick fog that I could not dispel. And worst of all, I no longer felt safe even in my own home. My home was no longer my refuge. I decided to call the police, but something stopped me. I didn't want anyone meddling in what I now felt was personal. The pain was mine, the loss was mine, and the threat I felt, though invisible, was also mine. I called a close friend, someone who trusted me and always helped me when something went wrong. I told him what I had found, but his reaction was not what I expected. The concern in his voice, the disbelief, only added to the weight in my chest. He suggested I go to the vet to try to find out how Estrelita had died, but I knew it didn't matter. She was gone. That night, sleep did not come. My mind was too busy with questions that had no answers. But as I was thinking, the memory of that phrase kept haunting my mind. You continue. What did that phrase mean? Who was it directed at? Fear made me think of the worst, of something much bigger and scarier than any simple act of meanness toward my cat. Eventually, what terrified me most was not Estrelita's death, but the feeling that something much darker was about to come. Days passed, and the nightmare that had begun with Estrelita's death did not dissipate. The rain continued to fall almost daily, as if the sky wanted to drown my suffering. But it was not only the weather that affected me, but the feeling of being watched, of being under the shadow of a threat I could not identify. Every time I looked out the window, I found myself looking for something, although I didn't know what. The fact that Estrelita had been killed in that way, for no apparent reason, and that someone had left me that message in the garden, plunged me into a paranoia I could not get out of. People in the neighborhood began to notice that something wasn't right with me. The absence of my cat left a palpable void in my house, and my friends no longer saw me as they used to. The uneasiness grew by the minute, and the feeling that something or someone was stalking me only increased. The phrase I had found next to her body began to haunt me. You continue. Every time I thought of her, my body tensed, my hands grew cold, and fear gripped me with brutal force. I felt trapped in an invisible web, which was closing in more and more. One night, I decided to do something. I was tired of living in fear. I left the house even though the weather was still rainy and cold, and started walking around the neighborhood. I had no clear destination, but I needed to clear my mind, to find an answer, even if it was just the slightest clue. As I walked in the rain, I felt something watching me from the shadows, but I couldn't turn around. The mere thought of someone following me made my nerves stand on edge. I walked through the deserted streets, my mind whirling around that phrase. You go on. I kept repeating it over and over again, like a mantra that wouldn't let me think clearly. My mind tried to find a logical explanation, but I could not. The fear of the irrational had taken control of me, and the worst thing was that I had no one to turn to. No one would believe me. No one would understand what I was feeling. It was then, as I turned down one of the streets that bordered the neighborhood, that I saw something strange. In a house that had never caught my eye before, the light was on in a second story, which was odd, since most of the houses in that area were turned off at that hour. The most disturbing thing was that this house had been empty for months. No neighbors had moved in, and the place had been totally silent. Suddenly, that light on seemed like a sign to me, an indication that something wasn't right. I approached cautiously, walking slowly, making no noise, not wanting to alert anyone. From a distance, I watched the window, trying to see something. What I saw froze me completely. In the gloom of the room, I could see the figure of a person, someone moving slowly, as if waiting for something. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt as if I had done something extremely dangerous, but I couldn't stop myself. Something inside me urged me to continue. I decided to get closer. I felt the pressure in my chest, as if I was making a mistake by approaching that place. But I could not ignore it. Something was pushing me to find out the truth. Finally, I got close enough to see clearly. I saw that this person was not alone. There was another figure, this one darker, more diffuse, moving around the room. I couldn't make out their faces, but something in their gestures sent a shiver down my spine. Just as I was about to back away and leave the scene, something moved behind me. Someone had seen me. I turned sharply, but saw no one. Just the fuzzy figure that faded into the shadows. My breathing quickened, my head was spinning, and adrenaline surged through my body. I decided to return home, but I could not stop thinking about what I had seen. There was something in that house, something that did not leave me calm. There was something strange in that figure, something that connected with my fear. And then I knew. The threat was not only related to Estrelita's death. There was someone in the neighborhood who was watching me, who was leaving messages for me, who was somehow taking control of my life. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on my bed, looking out the window, hoping to see something that would confirm my suspicions. But nothing happened. The next day, the feeling of being watched was still there, like a shadow, sticking to my skin. I felt I had taken too big a step in search of the truth, and now there was no turning back. The next day was worse. I received another message. This time, it was more direct. An envelope was under the door. I opened it with trembling hands, and inside I found a photograph. It was a blurry image, taken from far away. In it, Estrelita was standing in the garden, exactly where I had found her dead days before. But the strangest thing was that there was something else in the picture. A blurred figure hidden in the shadows who seemed to be watching her. Something about that image made me freeze. Not only was someone watching me, but now he was playing with me. It was targeting my fears, my suffering, and it seemed to be feeding on it. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I went to the police, but I knew that, as before, they wouldn't believe a word of it. No one could understand. No one could understand the feeling of being stalked by a presence that could not be seen, by a danger that had no form. The police merely told me to stay calm and take care of myself. That didn't help me in the least. Worst of all, as the days went by, paranoia took hold of me. I began to see strange figures in the windows, to hear footsteps when no one was there. To every dark corner I attributed a sinister meaning. My mind was no longer under control. The feeling that someone was constantly near me became an unbearable burden. The pressure of not knowing what to do, of having no answers, ate me up inside. Finally, I decided to leave the neighborhood. I couldn't go on living like that, afraid that the next person I saw would be my executioner. But before I left, I felt I had to go back to that house, the one I'd watched days before. Something inside me told me that the answer to everything was there. I needed to confront that presence, that threat. And I was willing to do it, even if it meant risking my life. What one cannot see is what one fears most. Uncertainty, the fear of the unknown, devours us in ways we never imagined. I thought Estrelita's death was the worst thing that could happen to me, but I soon understood that the shadows that lurk are not easy to escape. When someone plays with your fears, when they stalk you from the shadows, you lose something much more important than physical safety. You lose your peace of mind, your ability to trust what you see. In the end, you realize that the worst thing is not the enemies you see, but those who are hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't the storm that got me. That day, the sky was gray, but the rain was not yet falling with full fury. Inside my house, however, the tension was already present. and it wasn't due to the heavy clouds gathering on the horizon. I was in the process of remodeling the apartment in which my wife Veronica and I had decided to establish our life together. And as with any project, expectations often intersect with uncertainty. My Aunt Marlet was one of the first to take an interest in my work, though not in the way I expected. What began as an innocent curiosity soon turned into a disturbing obsession. My relationship with Marlet had always been distant. She lived near my house about 3 blocks away. For many years, she had been a peripheral figure in my life. I knew she had mental problems, but I never thought that could put me in danger. I never saw her as a real threat. After all, family is family, and one tends to think that blood ties protect us from the real threats in the world. But of course, that was before everything changed. When I started working on the remodel, I was excited. It was an opportunity to improve the place we shared, to make it more comfortable and beautiful. At first, Marlet's visits were sporadic. He would come to my house to see how the work was progressing, and I thought it was just his way of getting involved. Nothing unusual about that, right? But what at first seemed like a familiar act of interest began to feel awkward. Marlet was coming around more often, and each time his comments became more insistent. "You shouldn't be doing this that way," he would say with a steady, cold stare. "This place needs more than just a paint job. You need something deeper, something that brings it all back." I distinctly remember the first time he made me feel uncomfortable. I was finishing assembling a bookshelf in the living room when, unbeknownst to me, she appeared in the doorway of the room, silently watching me. Her presence made me turn around, and as I looked at her, I noticed that something in her eyes was not normal. There was a mixture of something that was not curiosity, not even anger, but something much more somber, an emptiness in her gaze that disturbed me deeply. But I didn't pay too much attention to it. I treated her kindly, as I always did, because I didn't dare to think that something as trivial as remodeling could trigger something else. However, the disappearances started soon after. First it was small things. A coffee cup I left on the table, a pair of gloves I had left in the hall, a wristwatch I had forgotten in the kitchen. At first I thought maybe Veronica had moved them or lost them somewhere. But then more important items began to go missing. Things that can't be easily lost. A box of old photos I kept in a drawer, a couple of my mother's rings, a small collection of books I used to keep on the bookshelf. It was then that I became suspicious. But what surprised me most was not the theft, but that it was all being carried out so subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if someone had a deep knowledge of my habits, of what I used to leave around. I decided to put myself on alert. I installed security cameras at the entrance and in some key parts of the house, and it was there that I began to see what I didn't want to see. The recordings showed my Aunt Marlet entering my house without making a sound. On several occasions, in the wee hours of the morning, she would approach and sneak in through the back door, which I forgot to close. Her movements were careful, meticulous. She didn't seem to be stealing out of necessity, but for something much darker, as if she was looking for something I couldn't understand. I saw her snooping in every corner, opening drawers, touching things she knew I cared about, and it made my blood run cold. But I still refused to believe what I was seeing. My aunt couldn't be responsible. She couldn't be. Rational explanations came flooding back. Maybe someone else was involved. Maybe I was mistaken. But the images were clear. Marlet had not only broken into my house, he had done it on a regular basis. And if that wasn't enough, there was something else that began to disturb me even more. The strange behavior she had begun to exhibit. When I saw her, not only did she talk about the remodel with that strange mix of friendliness and disapproval, but her eyes seemed to pierce me. There was something different about her, something that made me feel uncomfortable, almost as if I was watching a stranger and not family. The threats began to become evident as I began to confront her. At first she tried to play it down, but when I asked her directly about the disappearing things, her expression changed. She was no longer the aunt I knew, that woman who barely cared about others. The next time I felt his presence was during the night. We were sleeping peacefully when something, a dull thud, woke me up. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. It was like a subtle knock on the back door. I got out of bed, the room still in darkness, and the sound persisted. Something inside me told me not to go, but my mind, filled with doubt, compelled me to do so. I walked with stealthy steps to the entrance, and as I reached the threshold, I could see that the door was ajar. The key was outside, hanging on the hinge. There was something not right. I went out into the courtyard without making a sound, looking for any sign of someone, but there was nothing. However, fear enveloped me like a dense fog. When I returned to the house, I met Veronica, who was half awake. She asked me what was wrong, and when I explained what had happened, she told me that I must have forgotten to close the door, or that it was the wind. But what disturbed me was that the door had not been left open by accident. Someone had been there, and that person had somehow managed to get in and out without me noticing. The following days became more and more unsettling. In every corner of the house, in every whisper of the wind, I felt that something or someone was stalking me. I couldn't stop looking back when I went out into the garden, not even when I stayed indoors. The feeling of being watched intensified. There were times when I couldn't stand it anymore, and I would look out the window, expecting to find Marlet watching me from the street, as she had done that time, in the rain. That night I saw her again at the door, but she wasn't there. There was nothing, just the early morning mist and the incessant rain that continued to pound on the windows. No, this time there was something dark in her gaze, something he had never noticed before. "Don't worry about it," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's just that this place doesn't belong to you anymore. You owe all this to me. You know that, don't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. It wasn't just the way he spoke to me, but the way he looked at me. There was a strange control, a certainty, as if he was somehow managing the whole situation, as if I had become a piece in his game. I decided not to argue any further. It was clear that something was not right. There was too much tension in his attitude, too much darkness that I could not simply ignore. One night, the situation came to a head. I was sitting on the couch, trying to unwind from all the stress of the day, when I heard a tapping on the window. At first I thought it was the wind, but when I looked, there was Marlet, soaking wet, standing in the rain, staring into the house. She didn't say anything, didn't make a move. She just stood there, watching me. I froze, not knowing what to do. My heart was pounding, fear gripped me. But the worst thing was that I didn't know if she was waiting for me to come out, or if she just wanted me to see her. Veronica asked me if I should go talk to her, but something inside me prevented me from doing so. It wasn't the kind of situation that was resolved with words. Something inside me told me that my aunt had crossed a line that could not be ignored. And though I tried to rationalize the situation, the fear began to sink in deeper. That night, after Marlet left, I decided it was time to act. It was no longer a matter of petty theft, no longer a matter of simple threats. My life and my wife's life were at stake. What had begun as a simple remodel had become an emotional, psychological battleground, a place where my own family had become a strange enemy. It was then that I decided to go to the police. No one wanted to believe that my aunt, the woman I had been so close to in my childhood, was capable of something like this. But the evidence was clear, and by the time the authorities arrived at her home, they could not ignore the magnitude of what she had done. Marlet had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. The police arrested her and took her to a psychiatric facility where she could receive treatment. But at that moment, I already realized something I will never forget. Real fear does not always come from what you expect. Danger can be at home, in those you consider harmless. The arrest of my Aunt Marlet, although necessary, was not the solution I had hoped for. It could be said that it was a momentary relief, But the consequences of all that had happened did not take long to manifest themselves. The storm, though it had ceased, still seemed to be raging inside me. Life with Veronica was trying to regain its course. But in the stillness of the nights, in the shadows of the corridors, fear persisted, nestled in every corner of the house, as real as reality itself. The thought of my aunt being locked up in a psychiatric facility should have given me peace. But it did not. As soon as she disappeared from my life, something inside me, a part of me that I had been ignoring for weeks, woke up. And that part told me that the real terror was not what Marlet had done, but what she had left behind. The sense of vulnerability, the certainty that anything, at any moment, could shatter the peace of mind I had thought I had. At first I tried to convince myself that it was all behind me, that the threat no longer existed. The days continued to pass, with their routines. Veronica and I went back to work, back to the living room, back to the little daily fights that only happen when everything seems to be in place. But in every step, in every movement, there was something in me that told me I couldn't let my guard down. That feeling of being watched would not go away, and the house, which had once been my refuge, became a labyrinth of insecurities. One of the first signs that something wasn't right occurred in the office. I was sitting at my desk, looking at some papers I had left on the table. When I looked up for an instant, I swore I saw Marlet. He was there, standing in the doorway, watching me from the doorway. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't possible. I knew she was locked up in the psychiatric center, but that vision, that blurry image of her face wouldn't go away from my mind. In the blink of an eye, the figure vanished. I stood up suddenly, searching the room, checking every corner, but there was nothing. Only the echo of my own footsteps. Veronica came running when she heard the noise, worried about my reaction, but when I told her what had happened, she tried to play it down, suggesting that I was tired, or that the situation had left a deep impression on me. I decided then that I had to do something else. I went to the psychiatric center where Marlet was being held. I needed answers, although I knew that at the same time I was looking for something I didn't understand myself. What I expected to find, I don't know. Perhaps a confirmation that she could not harm me, that her presence was limited to her confinement. But when I arrived at the center and they told me about her, something inside me made me doubt that everything was in order. The doctor who attended me seemed uncomfortable talking about her condition. "She's doing much better than when she arrived," he told me with a strained smile, but his eyes did not reflect certainty. "He has shown progress, but there are still times when his behavior is unpredictable." He told me this with such a distant tone, as if he was trying to downplay something that was really bothering him. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I didn't say anything. I just nodded and left. As I returned home, something told me that I shouldn't let my guard down, that Marlet's threat hadn't disappeared just because she was somewhere else. The way she talked about the house, how she had claimed it as her own, was more than just an obsession. There was a dangerous energy behind her words, something far more disturbing than petty threats or thefts. Worst of all was doubt. Had she been the one breaking into my house? Or was there someone else? What if she never really left? The fear of the unknown was consuming me, and no matter what I did, I couldn't shake it. The visits to the psychiatric center continued, but I found it increasingly difficult to believe in the reassurance they were trying to sell me. The feeling that Marlet had something else up his sleeve, something I had not fully understood, continued to grow. And it was then that I knew, with frightening certainty, that the threat was not over. Marlet had not only invaded my home, she had not only touched my belongings and my memories. She had accomplished something much deeper. She had planted a seed of distrust in me that I could not uproot. One day, as I was getting ready to leave for work, I came across a letter on my desk. It was handwritten, in familiar handwriting, but crumpled, as if it had been put away for a long time. I opened it slowly, and as I read the words, my stomach cringed. The letter read as follows: "I know you haven't forgotten what you did, and what you did, we will all pay for it." I didn't need any more. My Aunt Marlet was closer than I thought. And her threat was more than just a reminder. It was a clear message. She was still controlling my life, even from where I was. That night when I turned out the lights, fear enveloped me again. But it was not only fear of the unknown, but a disturbing certainty. Some shadows do not fade with time, and emotional violence is much more persistent than any other kind of attack. My aunt, in her madness, had accomplished something I had never imagined. She had left her imprint, not only on the objects in the house, but on my mind. And that imprint, now, felt indelible. What really terrified me was not what my Aunt Marlet had done, nor the disappearances or the threats. What terrified me was the emptiness she left in my life, the feeling that nothing was under control, that the people we love most are capable of turning us into prey if we give them the power to do so. The scars left on us by the people closest to us are the hardest to see, but the deepest to heal. And as one moves on, the footprints of those loved ones can continue to lurk, reminding us that the real danger is not always in the visible, but in what lurks beneath the surface. Rain has never bothered me. In fact, it has always seemed to me to have something almost cozy about it, like a blanket that envelops the world and makes it more intimate, quieter. But that night the storm made me feel something different. The sound of the drops hitting the glass was deafening, almost as if nature itself was trying to alert me to something. But I didn't want to listen. Camilla and I had had a long week, and a quiet night at home was what we needed most. We snuggled in bed with the lights off, the TV on, showing some movie in the background. Camilla had already fallen asleep next to me, her breathing calm and rhythmic, while I was still awake, staring at the screen without really seeing anything. The hum of the storm outside and the repetitive sound of the fan were the only noises creeping into the room. The night, in theory, should have been perfect. But suddenly, I heard it. A dull thud. Loud, dry, as if someone had thrown a heavy sack against the front door. At first, I thought it was the wind, something the storm had pushed hard, maybe some object that had blown into the wood. But when the thump was repeated, I couldn't ignore it. I got out of bed slowly, trying not to wake Camilla, but she, however, woke up immediately. In the half-light, I saw her turn to me, her eyes half open. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice trailing off in sleep. "Shh, wait," I muttered, pointing toward the door. Another knock echoed, louder this time, as if someone was pounding with their fist. I left the room and headed for the entrance without making a sound. The house was plunged into a heavy silence, as if everything had fallen into a state of alertness. When I reached the door, the peephole showed only absolute emptiness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, waiting. I peered through the small slit cautiously, but saw nothing. Not a shadow, not a figure. Who could it be at this hour? I thought, as I tried to calm myself. I closed the peephole and stood in front of the door, listening in the dark. The knock sounded again, louder this time, and it made me jump immediately. I felt the fear taking hold of me, something primal that I couldn't control. It wasn't a robbery. It couldn't be, because no one could have gotten that close without me noticing. I squeezed the door handle, felt the lock intact, but the sound did not stop. On the contrary, it seemed to intensify. I looked down the hallway and saw the figure of Camilla, who had quietly left the room with a worried expression. "What's going on?" she whispered, almost frightened. Camilla's voice trembled slightly, and her presence made the fear in my chest grow even more. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't explain to her what I was feeling. If I told her I was sure something or someone was outside, she would probably think I was exaggerating. Then the knocking stopped. A second of absolute silence. And then another blow, this time much louder. I was startled and ran to the door. I looked through the peephole again, but saw no one. Only the rain, which continued to fall unceasingly. There were no footprints, no trace of any stranger, only the dampness seeping through the windows. Something inside me told me not to open the door, that I shouldn't open it. But confusion and fear overcame me. I squeezed the handle and, cautiously, opened the door a little. The sound of the storm outside was deafening, and the darkness blinded me. At that moment, I felt someone or something watching me. I looked down the hall, but no one was there. I gritted my teeth and slammed the door shut, feeling that something else was at stake. Something much more frightening than just fear of the unknown. I returned to the room, my body tense and my mind agitated. Camilla kept looking at me, her eyes searching for answers. "What happened?" she insisted. I didn't know what to tell her. The feeling of being watched lingered in the air, but I couldn't explain to her that I felt an inexplicable pressure. No one was outside, I knew, but I couldn't help thinking that something was wrong. Everything was wrong. We lay down again, but this time I couldn't close my eyes. Anxiety coursed through me like an electric current, with each blink feeling as if the door was going to open again. The sound of the storm was increasing, and the wind was whipping at the windows, as if the whole world was pushing at us. Every drop falling on the glass was like a reminder that we were trapped, vulnerable, exposed. But the worst was yet to come. As I tried to calm down, a new blow resounded in the distance. This time, farther away, but still there. A strange sound, a pressure in the air. And then, again the thump, this time much closer. Thump after thump, as if an invisible hand was pounding on the walls of our house. My body tensed, and when I looked at Camila, I saw that she too was alert, aware of what was happening. She was no longer asleep, no longer calm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, voice raspy with worry. "Yes," I answered, unable to help myself. My voice was a trembling whisper, full of doubt. The sound of the pounding suddenly stopped and all was deathly silent. The clock read 3:42 a.m., and the fear had become an unbearable pressure. I knew I wasn't crazy. I knew something wasn't right. There was something out there, waiting, and I couldn't do anything about it. Camilla and I looked at each other in the darkness. The atmosphere grew thicker with each passing second. The uncertainty, the tension, was present, like a shadow lurking. Several minutes, or maybe hours, passed. But at some point, I got up again. I couldn't just stand there and not know what was going on. I decided to investigate. But as I approached the door, the final knock resounded. It was the sound of something breaking, the front door being violated, attacked, as if someone wanted to force their way in. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I ran to the door immediately, stood in front of it and looked at it, not knowing what to do. The tension was so high that my mind could not process what was happening. Then, suddenly, the door to the street opened by itself. The sound of the door opening was unlike any other. It wasn't the soft creak of wood sliding off the hinges. No, this time the sound was harsh, violent, as if something or someone had ruthlessly picked the lock. My heart stopped for an instant. In the blink of an eye, the house went from a quiet refuge to a threatening, dangerous place, as if we were in the middle of a nightmare from which we could not wake up. I couldn't understand what was happening. I could not process what my senses were telling me. The door was wide open, and in front of it on the threshold stood a figure. I couldn't see her well. The storm, the darkness, and the strong wind partially covered her, but what I could make out was enough to make my blood run cold. It was a woman, tall, with wet hair, sticking to her face, but something in her posture made me feel that she was no ordinary person. She was motionless, still, staring at me with a disturbing intensity. At that moment, the fear I felt had no form, no reason. It was a primitive, visceral terror, as if the very nature of the human being was in danger. The woman did not move. The darkness behind her seemed to engulf her, while her eyes, though I could not see them clearly, felt as if they were staring at me. The rain continued to fall hard, but for me the outside world ceased to exist. All that remained was that figure, the emptiness of the open door, and the fear that gripped my body. I don't know how long I spent staring at that figure. Camilla was next to me, now completely awake, also looking towards the door with her eyes wide open. The pounding in my chest, the knot in my stomach, did not let me think clearly. My mind was saturated with doubts and unanswered questions. Who was that woman? Why was she there, in the middle of the storm, at the most unusual hour of the night? What did she want from us? The woman did not move an inch. In fact, she looked more like a statue than a person, rigid and motionless in the doorway. With each passing second, her presence became more unbearable, more strange, as if her very existence there was a latent threat. I thought about closing the door, but something stopped me. Something told me that, if I did, the consequences would be much worse. It was Camilla who broke the silence. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice trembling, but steady. There was no longer a trace of sleep in his eyes. There was only fear, just as there was in mine. I didn't answer him. I didn't know what to say. My throat was dry, and the only thing I could think of was what to do next. Should we call the police? Lock the door and barricade ourselves in the apartment? Go outside and confront her? Before she could decide, the woman took a step forward. That movement was enough to make my whole body react immediately. I lunged for the door, trying to close it quickly, but it was too late. With surprising force, the woman pushed the door inward, almost knocking me down in the process. I stumbled over the threshold, losing my balance, and barely managed to take a step back before she entered the apartment. The door was left wide open, and rain poured down the hallway, soaking the floor. My mind could not process what I was seeing. That woman, who until a second ago seemed so distant and alien, was now less than a meter away from me. Her face was still fuzzy, hidden by the wet hair falling over her eyes, but I could feel the presence of her gaze. It stretched my nerves, bent my soul. Her body, on the other hand, seemed incredibly firm, as if she wasn't there by chance. Camilla instinctively backed away, sticking to the wall, but her eyes could not take her eyes off the woman. The tension was so palpable that the air seemed heavy, as if it had become thick and difficult to breathe. "Who are you? What do you want from us?" I said, unable to keep the panic from seeping into my voice. But she didn't answer. She didn't say a word. She just took another step forward, as if what was happening was the most natural thing in the world. My legs trembled beneath me. Disbelief, fear, and confusion made me think I was dreaming. How was it possible that this woman, who I didn't even know who she was inside my house, at this hour, without any explanation? The distance between us was rapidly shrinking, and it was then that I noticed him. Although his face was almost covered, there was something in his demeanor, something in the way he moved, that chilled me even more. There was a strange calmness in his movements, a tranquility in his presence that did not match the gravity of the situation. It was as if he was not afraid of anything, not of me, not of Camilla, not of what might happen next. It was at that moment that a frightening thought crossed my mind. Maybe this woman wasn't looking for answers. Maybe there was no logical reason for her presence, and the reason for her appearance was something much more sinister. Maybe she was just waiting, like an animal stalking its prey. Maybe her only objective was us. With that thought in mind, I made the decision to act. I couldn't just stand there paralyzed. I had to do something. I shouted to Camilla to run into the room, lock herself in, and call the police. But before I could lift a finger, the woman advanced toward me with unexpected speed. She extended her hand, her fingers elongated like claws, toward my neck. I quickly pulled away, dodging her hand, and ran into the living room, thinking of nothing but protecting myself and Camilla. My mind was in chaos. My body wasn't responding the way I wanted it to, but I managed to put a table between me and her. I knew I was at a disadvantage. She was stronger, more determined than me. I could see it in the way she moved, in the way her presence filled the whole space. My first instinct was to try to close the door, but when I reached it, The woman was already there. She pushed it as easily as before, and in a couple of seconds she was back in front of me. Anguish came over me. There was no way out. There was no way to escape. All that was left was to wait, and pray that all this was not a nightmare that I did not know how it would end. At that moment, the woman's figure began to blur before my eyes. It was as if her presence became more blurred, more diffuse. The rain was still pounding against the windows, but she seemed more distant, as if the world had shrunk around her. And that's when, for a second, I thought that maybe it had all been an illusion, a trick of my mind, until the woman disappeared completely. But when I looked toward the door, her silhouette was still there, standing in the storm, looking in. And now, she was no longer alone. Sometimes, the real danger is not in what we can see, nor in what we can touch. It is in what we do not understand, in what we cannot control. It is not the darkness that frightens us, but what is hidden in it. The storm, the open door, the unknown woman, all of it was not just an event. It was a warning. Because in the end, what we fear most is what we don't know, what we can't predict. And when faced with what we can't control, the only way out is to stay trapped, as if the real threat is already inside us. I remember perfectly the day we decided to go to the house in the mountains. Francisco and I had talked about it for months, planning to escape the hustle and bustle of the city, get away from the stress, and just enjoy nature. Sometimes, the simplest ideas are the ones that end up being the most dangerous. I didn't know it at the time, of course, but now I realize how close we came to never leaving. The house was about a 3-hour drive from the city. It was an old building, a wooden shelter that didn't look like it had been maintained in years. Its walls had a patina of dust and neglect, and the air, thick and cold, was permeated with the smell of damp earth and old wood. Even though everything looked a bit run down, the idea of spending the weekend there, away from it all, was appealing to me. Francisco, my best friend for years, was just as excited. Despite his tendency to be a bit paranoid, he had always been the first to suggest getaways and adventures. This time was no exception, and somehow, he convinced us both that the mountains would give us what we needed: rest, solitude, and a few days of disconnection. We arrived at the house as evening was beginning to fall. The storm, which had started as a light drizzle, soon intensified. Dark clouds covered the sky imposingly, and the rain began to pound hard on the roof of the house. The temperature dropped sharply, and a cold, damp wind began to whisper through the cracks in the windows, making the atmosphere gloomier. I didn't mind. The idea of being away from the city, no phones, no obligations, seemed perfect. At first, all was quiet. We set up the fireplace, settled on the sofas, and for a few hours, enjoyed the calm that the storm brought with it. The lights flickered at times, but we didn't think much of it. It was just a passing discomfort. Francisco insisted that we shouldn't worry about the phone signal. "We're here to disconnect, aren't we?" he told me. And he was right, of course. The phone stopped working after a short while, something that bothered me at first, but which I soon let go of. The disconnect was part of the experience. It was then that I began to notice something strange. Through the living room window, the rain was falling furiously, creating a gray curtain that distorted the view of what was outside. However, something about the movement of the shadows disturbed me. The shadows of the trees, stirred by the wind, seemed to move erratically. At first I thought it was just my imagination or the flickering light from the lamps in the house, but every time I looked outside, I felt that something was watching. "Have you noticed the shadows?" I asked Francisco, trying not to sound paranoid. He looked up from his book, but didn't seem all that worried. "It's just the wind. Don't get nervous. We're miles from civilization. There's nothing here." Despite his words, something was still in the air, a feeling I could not identify. As the storm raged, the sound of the wind and rain intensified, and with it, my bad feeling. Something was out of place, but I couldn't explain it. At dinner time, we decided to go out on the small, covered porch overlooking the woods behind the house. The air was heavy with humidity, and the storm was raging. It was so dark at night that we could barely see a couple of feet ahead. At that moment, the house didn't seem as cozy as before. Every creak of the timbers, every whine of the wind made me think the worst. Francisco, with his characteristic optimism, insisted that it was a great idea to get some fresh air. And so we did. Although, to be honest, I was not entirely at ease. While we were outside, something caught our attention. A sound. It wasn't the wind, or the sound of rain hitting the roof. It was a footstep, a rustling in the dry leaves, a low sound, as if someone was walking along the edge of the property. I looked at Francisco, but he didn't seem to have noticed. He looked back inside the house, as if seeking some kind of comfort in its safety. "Did you hear that?" I asked quietly. Now he did look at me, with a raised eyebrow. "Probably an animal. You know, foxes, deer. You're paranoid." But the feeling persisted. I could not shake the impression that we were being watched. I dared not look into the forest, into the shadows lengthening in the rain. Someone, was watching us. I could feel it on my skin. We decided to go back inside the house. We closed the door with a sharp bang, and the sound of the storm became even more intense, as if it was enveloping us completely. The air inside the house was heavy, stale, and the light from the lamps seemed dimmer than before. The fireplace failed to heat the space efficiently, and darkness seemed to be seeping through every crevice. We sat back down in the living room. The sound of the rain pounding the house was now deafening. The only thing breaking the silence was the creaking of wood and the faint noises coming from upstairs, where we hadn't gone since we arrived. At that moment, a deeper, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. A soft, repetitive tapping, as if someone was upstairs. My first thought was that it was the roof, that some raindrop was hitting the shingles and vibrating through the roof timbers. But no, the pounding didn't match the rhythm of the storm. It was irregular, as if someone was looking for something, or someone. I looked back at Francisco, who was no longer reading. He had also noticed the sound. His eyes were fixed on the door to the hallway that led to the rest of the house. The knocking continued, faint at first, but getting clearer and clearer, closer and closer. Suddenly, the house was plunged into absolute silence. The pounding stopped. The rain also stopped, and the feeling of being watched intensified even more. The air in the room became thick, as if filled with static electricity. The light from the lamps flickered briefly before going out completely, leaving us in total darkness. "I'm going to see what's going on," Francisco said, rising from the couch. But his voice sounded hollow, more a whisper of discomfort than determination. He grabbed the flashlight from the table and headed down the hall. I followed him, unsure if I should really follow him or stay behind. The darkness was so thick that with every step we took, the sounds of the house seemed to multiply. The creaking of the wood, the soft blows of the wind, the echo of our own footsteps. It was as if everything was amplified, distorted. The knocking sounded again, louder now, but it came from the upper floor. The staircase leading to the bedrooms was to our left. With a tight feeling in my chest, I looked up the dark hallway that extended to the second floor, where the house was even quieter. Something or someone was there, and it wasn't an animal. Suddenly, a thud came from the stairs, as if someone had hit the floor or dropped something heavy. The tension in the air became unbearable. The house was not empty. At that moment, Francisco began to climb the stairs, his flashlight in front of him. The trembling light briefly illuminated the damp-covered walls, but as he reached the first landing, something changed. The light went out. And in the silence that followed, I knew we were no longer alone. The darkness was absolute. The flashlight that Francisco had carried went out without warning, and with it, any hope of having something to guide us in that cold and isolated house. The air became thicker, heavier, as if the house itself was breathing with us, waiting for something that was about to happen. At that instant, a shiver ran down my spine and my mind became completely clouded. unable to think clearly. The sound of the wind, now soft, crept through the cracks in the windows, but even that seemed far away, as if we were trapped in a tunnel with no out. My heart began to pound. I looked at Francisco, who was standing on the first step of the staircase, looking out into the dark hallway with an expression I could not identify. The seconds seemed to have stretched out, becoming interminable. Only the dull creaking of the wood beneath our feet could be heard, the only sound that broke the absolute silence. The air was so tense that I found it difficult to breathe. I didn't understand what was happening. I couldn't understand why the flashlight had failed, nor why the knocking had stopped so suddenly. The fear was not rational. There was no direct threat, nothing visible. But my body responded with an instinctive response, the same as when you know something is not right, even when you can't explain it. My whole being was telling me that the house wasn't empty. And if it wasn't, who or what was with us? "Francisco," I said, trying to make my voice sound firmer than I felt. "Do you want me to get new batteries for the flashlight?" My friend did not respond, nor did he move. He just stood there, staring into the darkness with that strange stillness. At that moment, I felt something run through me inside, as if I was about to understand something I didn't want to know. That's when the flashlight came back on for a second, casting a dim light that briefly illuminated the hallway. But it wasn't the light that stopped me. It was what I saw in that split second. At the far end of the hallway, a figure was gliding along, barely noticeable, as if trying to hide in the shadows. But I couldn't miss it. It was something human, but not human. It had a slender, almost ethereal silhouette, and its movement was unnatural. It was as if it walked with an unnatural stiffness, as if it were crawling along the ground without wanting to be detected, without wanting to make noise. My mind tried to deny what I had seen. It was impossible. You had to be crazy to think that someone, or something, was inside the house with us. However, instinct told me that the figure was real. And at the same instant that image faded into the darkness, Francisco's flashlight went out again, plunging the place into an impenetrable gloom. Fear came over me, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, completely frozen. I didn't even dare to breathe, for fear that the slightest sound might alert the figure, whatever it was that was stalking us. Everything inside me screamed that I should do something, but my legs did not respond. I stood there, motionless, waiting for the next move, knowing that somewhere, in the shadows, something or someone was lurking. "Francisco," I said again, this time not knowing if I was saying it to myself or to him. Finally, Francisco moved. His figure was barely distinguishable in the darkness, but I watched as he began to descend the stairs. The flashlight was out again, and in the darkness, Francisco's footsteps seemed to echo louder than they should. Fear gripped me even more when I heard a sound coming from the upper floor. A creak, a sudden movement, as if someone had fallen or pushed something. Before I could react, a scream broke the silence. A low, barely audible cry, which quickly became a murmur of despair. Francisco was there, in the darkness, but his voice was different, trembling. I couldn't tell what was happening, but the tone in his voice was enough to make me alert. Without thinking, I ran to him. The house seemed to crumble around me. The rain was still pounding hard on the windows, but I could no longer hear it. The creaking of the house's timbers, the echoes of our footsteps, everything was distorted, as if we were trapped in a dream we couldn't control. I rushed up the stairs, reaching the top landing. The house was dark. Every corner felt dangerous. But despite the panic that paralyzed me, I had to look for Francisco. I didn't know what I had heard, but the fear in his voice told me something terrible was happening. I felt watched, as if I was not alone, as if someone was behind me, following me, waiting for an oversight. On the second floor, all was silent. The bedroom doors were closed, but there was no sign of Francisco. Anguish began to take hold of me as my eyes roamed the dark hallway, searching for any clue to his whereabouts. The tension was unbearable. I didn't dare call out his name. Something told me that if I did, it would be the last thing I would do in that house. A noise broke the stillness. A light, almost imperceptible knocking sound reached my ears. My body reacted instinctively, turning my eyes towards the end of the corridor. In the distance, in the gloom, something moved. Something that was not Francis. Something that was not human. The figure appeared again, moving slowly toward me. This time it was not hidden in the shadows. I could see it clearly. It was a man, or what was left of him. His skin was pale and stretched to the bone, as if he had gone a long time without food or water. His face was gaunt. His mouth was open in a grimace that fell short of a scream. The eyes, though bloodshot, glowed with a strange intensity. His gaze was fixed, and like the figure I saw before, his movement was clumsy, almost mechanical. I remember standing still, paralyzed as the figure approached. I knew better than to look into his eyes. I knew that looking too much might be the last thing I would do, but I couldn't help it. It was as if an invisible force compelled me to do so. Suddenly, the figure vanished. It disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone, breathing heavily, my heart about to burst in my chest. A scream came from my throat, but it was drowned out by the sound of the rain. I couldn't think clearly. I couldn't reason. I just wanted to get out of that house, but I could not. I turned and ran to the door, but when I reached it, the door was shut tight, locked from the outside. I shouted, knocked on the wood, but there was no response. Then, the sound of a footstep, very close, and I understood the worst. We were not alone, and if we wanted to survive, we had to get out before it was too late. Sometimes we are unaware of the dangers around us. In a lonely house, under the storm, in the dark, danger is not always obvious, and survival becomes a matter of instinct rather than reason. What I learned that night is that the worst thing is not to face what is seen, but what we cannot understand. The idea of being watched, of being trapped in a place where danger lurks around every corner, is far more terrifying than any monster or ghost. Because in the end, the worst enemy we can face is our own perception of reality. I have always been the type of person who does not believe in warnings. Rebellion ran through my veins like the blood itself, and nothing could make me change course. It was after one of those family arguments, where words become knives, that I decided to leave home. My destiny was uncertain, but what I didn't know was that I was about to enter something that would change my life forever. It was a rainy night. The storm had suddenly erupted, and the sky was as black as darkness itself. My soaked clothes were beginning to stick to my skin, but I didn't care. I had nowhere to go. Not wanting to go to a cheap hotel in the area, I decided to take the first place I found on the road. A wooden sign, almost erased by the years, hung on a rusty gate. Guest house. It was an old two-story building with small, dark windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. Somehow, the house exuded a sense of abandonment, as if time had stopped passing there. I didn't have much of a choice. I knocked hard on the door, and the figure that appeared behind it did little to calm my nerves. It was an elderly woman with a wrinkled face and dark eyes that stared at me. Her presence was strange, even a little unsettling, but exhaustion clouded my judgment. He accepted my arrival without saying a word other than "come in." So, simply, he led me down a long hallway. The smell of mildew and damp wood hung in the air, and the walls were covered with a thick layer of dust that gave me the feeling that no one had touched the place in years. He assigned me a room on the second floor, away from the others, which struck me as odd, but my tiredness prevented me from asking any more questions. When I entered the room, the door closed with a heavy, dry sound, as if the house itself was sealing my fate. The room was sparsely furnished: an old bed, a nightstand with an unlit lamp, and a wooden chair that creaked when I sat down. But worst of all was the window. which let in nothing but the light of the storm. I lay in bed, exhausted, but something told me I couldn't sleep. Something in the air was wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Somehow, I felt like that house was watching me. In an attempt to ignore my thoughts, I closed my eyes and let myself be lulled by the sound of the rain. Suddenly, I heard something that made my eyes snap open. A creaking sound, a dull sound, coming from the first floor, as if someone was walking down the hallway. In an uninhabited house, that thought disturbed me. But I quickly told myself it was just the wind, that the old house was simply giving way to the storm. However, the sound didn't stop. I heard soft, almost stealthy footsteps approaching. I got out of bed and walked to the door, not knowing what to expect. When I opened it, the hallway was deserted, and the only thing that greeted me was the echo of my own footsteps. At first, I felt foolish, but then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, next to a closed door, a figure loomed. He stood there in the gloom watching. I couldn't make out her face, but somehow I knew it wasn't a visitor. It was the woman who had greeted me, standing by the door, motionless, like a statue. A cold shiver ran down my back. I closed the door quickly and sat down on the bed, trying to make my mind ration, but the restlessness was eating me up inside. The sound of the storm outside seemed louder now, the drops hitting the windows with such violence that I felt the house was going to collapse. I tried to sleep, but the feeling of being watched persisted. With every blink, I could see shadows moving behind the walls, shadows that did not belong to the people I could see. Suddenly, a scream that did not come from the storm. A human scream, heartbreaking, coming from the first floor. I couldn't help it. I threw open the door and went downstairs. But when I reached the lobby, all I found was the older woman standing there, watching me. "It's all right," she said matter-of-factly, her eyes fixed on mine. Without a word, I went back up the stairs. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't stay there any longer. However, when I looked up at my bedroom window, I noticed something strange. Outside in the garden, the shadows seemed to move, but no one was there, no one visible at least. The next morning, the sun seemed to have cleared some of the air, but the uneasy feeling did not go away. I got up and tried to get ready to go out. However, something stopped me. I saw that the gate leading to the garden was open, and through it, a figure was moving through the bushes. Instinctively, I took a step back, but something made me look once more. The woman from the night before stood in the garden, watching me, her dark eyes never leaving me. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't leave. Something was holding me there. Maybe it was the storm, maybe it was the tension, but at that moment, something made me think that I couldn't leave that house, that there was something hidden in it, something beyond the woman who had welcomed me. I knew immediately. I was not alone. The house, the owner, the residents, they all had deadly secrets. Those who passed by that house disappeared, and at that very moment, something inside me snapped. Something I had never experienced before. Pure fear. The fear that comes from realizing that you may never be able to get out of there. I stayed in the room, watching out the window as the storm continued to rage, but I couldn't help wondering what was behind the walls. Why the screaming? Why those people? My body was trapped, but my mind was not. At least not completely. The truth was much darker than I could ever imagine. I felt it then. Something or someone, in some corner of the house, was watching me too. I never fully understood what was going on in that house. There was something in its walls, something that swallowed people and made them disappear without a trace. What disturbed me most, however, was not the fact that the house was cursed, or that something sinister was happening there. What really terrified me was the realization that the real threat was not in the shadows or the screams. The real threat was in people, in what we are capable of doing, even when everything seems to be calm. Sometimes, no matter how far we go, there are things we simply can't avoid. And worst of all, there are times when we don't even realize we're trapped until it's too late.